The snow elves had a city on this coast. Then Ysgramor arrived. Within one generation, that city was ash. The people who survived ran underground and begged the Dwemer for help. The Dwemer helped them by feeding them toxic fungi until they went blind, then breeding them like animals for thousands of years. That is what became of the first people of Halfingr, and almost no one in Solitude today knows any of it. In the Merethic era, the age before written history, before empires, before the oldest Nord songs existed, the snow elves lived along this coast. Halfingr was their territory. The high cliffs gave them shelter. The cold sea gave them food. They had language, faith, and craft. They worshipped Auriel, the god the high elves later called Akatosh. They kept records. They had priests and scholars. This was not a rough camp of simple people huddled against the cold. This was a settled, functioning civilization that had claimed the Halfingr coastline for thousands of years. The sea wind moved through their structures every morning. The grey water of the Sea of Ghosts lay at the edge of everything they built, and for a long time, no one came to take any of it from them. The Sea of Ghosts is not a gentle body of water. It is cold and grey. Ice builds along its northern edges in winter. Storms arrive without warning. Most peoples of Tamriel kept their distance from it. The snow elves lived beside it for thousands of years. They learned its tides. They read its currents. They understood the specific patterns of water that ran along the Halfingr shore in ways that no outsider ever would. Their settlements sat close to the cliff edge. They used the sea as a border. It protected them on one side and fed them on the other. For long ages, that arrangement held. The water kept the world away. The snow elves simply lived, and the centuries moved past them quietly. Deep in the Merethic era, the snow elves were part of a larger people called the Oldmer. The Oldmer were the original elves of Tamriel, the root from which almost every elven civilization eventually grew. They came from the Somerset Isles long ago and slowly spread across the continent. Different groups moved in different directions. The snow elves were the branch that went north. They followed the coastlines up into the cold. Halfingr suited them. The cliffs were high, the land was hard, the weather pushed softer peoples away. And so the snow elves settled there and built something that lasted for ages. Their connection to the Aldmer gave them deep roots, a long history of knowledge, belief, and culture that stretched back further than most civilizations in Tamriel could claim. That history did not protect them in the end. Then the Atmorons came across the Sea of Ghosts. The Atmorons were the ancestors of the Nords. They sailed from a dying continent far to the north, called Atmora, a land growing colder every generation, harder to survive, slowly emptying of life. They crossed the sea in wooden ships and landed on the northern shores of Skyrim. Halfingr's coastline was among the first places they reached. The snow elves were already there. At first, the two peoples existed in uneasy proximity. Some lore suggests early contact was not immediately violent, but the peace did not hold. The Atmorons needed land. They took it. The snow elves were pushed back from the coast they had held for thousands of years. Slowly, at first. Then, faster. The balance that had lasted for ages collapsed within a few generations. The sea that had protected the snow elves now brought ships full of people who would not stop coming. The event that ended snow elf presence in Halfingr was called the Night of Tears. The snow elves attacked the early Nordic settlement of Sarthol. The Nords believed it was unprovoked aggression. Some lore suggests the snow elves had a deeper reason, something buried beneath Sarthol that frightened them, something they needed to keep hidden or destroy. The game does not give a clean answer. What it does give is what came next. Ysgramor returned from Atmora with 500 warriors. What followed was not a balanced war between two peoples. It was a removal. The snow elves of Halfingr and the surrounding regions were hunted, scattered, and driven from every place they had built. Some fled south. Some fled into the mountains. The ones who eventually went underground asked the Dwemer for shelter and walked into something far worse than the war they were escaping. What fragments of snow elf presence remain near modern Solitude? The game does not say clearly, but the lore points towards something. The cliffs of Halfingr are old, older than any Nordic structure built on them. The caves along that shore predate every wall and tower that came after. Some of the oldest cave formations in the region show signs of habitation that do not match Nordic building styles. There are worn carvings in the wilder parts of Hafengar that do not match any known Nordic rune set. Some players believe these are snow elf in origin. The game does not confirm it directly, but the land holds more than it explains. The stones of that coastline were shaped by hands that came long before any Nord looked up at the great arch of rock and thought to build a city there. The snow elves, who fled underground, went to the Dwemer, the deep elves, a civilization of scholars and engineers who lived beneath the earth. The Dwemer agreed to shelter the snow elves, but they set a condition. The snow elves had to eat a specific fungus that grew in the underground caves. The snow elves, desperate and with no other option, agreed. The fungus blinded them over generations. Their eyes grew pale and stopped working. Their bodies changed. Their minds simplified under thousands of years of darkness and control. The Dwemer used them as a servant class, kept blind so they could not navigate the surface world, kept dependent so they could not leave. Over many generations, the snow elves became something unrecognizable. History eventually called them the Falmer. They lost their language. They lost their faith. They lost the memory of the coast they had once called home. There is a quiet weight to all of this. The snow elves were not a small or simple people. They were ancient. They were capable. They had built a life on the Hafengar coast that lasted longer than most empires in Tamriel's history. And it was taken from them so completely that Solitude, the great city that now stands on their old territory, does not carry a single monument to their name. No stone, no song, no marker on the cliffside above the cold water. The Merethic era did not record their loss. The Nords who replaced them did not leave space for what had come before. And the sea that once protected the snow elves kept moving, indifferent. The same grey water it had always been. The first people of the cold shore are gone. What replaced them became one of the greatest cities in Tamriel. But the cliffs remember older things. The caves beneath Hafengar were carved long before Solitude existed. And somewhere in the stone of that coastline, the Merethic era still sits quietly, waiting for no one, forgotten by almost everyone. Atmora was dying. The cold was spreading. The land that had fed generations of people was hardening into something that could no longer support life. So the Atmorans did what people do when their home stops working. They left. They built ships from the last strong timber of a failing continent and pointed them south across the Sea of Ghosts. Not all of them landed in the same place. The currents of that cold sea pulled different ships toward different shores. And some of those ships, carrying the ancestors of the people who would one day build Solitude, reached the coast of Hafengar first. The Sea of Ghosts is not an easy crossing. It is wide and cold and unpredictable. Ice floats in its northern waters even in summer. The winds shift without pattern. A ship caught in the wrong current could be pushed far off course. But Hafengar has something that other parts of Skyrim's northern coast do not. Its geography creates a natural funnel. The great cliffs and the shape of the shoreline catch certain southern currents in a way that would have pulled wooden ships toward that specific stretch of coast. Atmoran sailors were experienced. They read the water carefully. They would have noticed the way the current moved near Hafengar. They would have followed it in. The landing was not random. The sea itself guided certain ships to that shore, and the people on those ships stepped onto land that would carry their descendants for thousands of years. The Atmorans who landed on the Hafengar coast were not arriving into empty wilderness. The snow elves were already there, an old people who had held that coastline for ages. The first meetings between Atmorans and snow elves were complicated. Some lore suggests there were periods of uneasy coexistence. Trade may have happened. Information about the land may have passed between the two groups. But the Atmorans needed space. They needed ground to build on, forests to cut, animals to hunt. The snow elves had already claimed the best of all of it. Tension was built into the situation from the beginning. Two peoples, one coastline, and no shared language for working it out peacefully. The early Atmoran settlers of Hafengar would have felt that tension every day, in the way the snow elves watched from the high ground, in the silence that sat between two groups who did not yet know how badly things would go. The Atmorans brought their culture with them across the sea. They were a people shaped by cold and hardship. They valued strength, loyalty, and the memory of the dead. They carried their ancestor stories in spoken form, no written records, just voices passing knowledge forward from one generation to the next. They believed in a set of animal totems that represented different virtues and powers. The wolf, the bear, the owl, the snake, the whale, the fox, the moth, each one connected to a way of living or fighting or thinking. These beliefs came with them to Halfingar. The first Atmoran settlers on that coast did not abandon who they were when they stepped off the ships. They rebuilt their world on new ground, using the same values they had carried from a dying continent. The cold of Halfingar felt familiar. The grey sea felt like home. Choosing where to settle was not a simple decision. The Halfingar coastline offers cliffs, open ground, and high rocky formations that overlook both the sea and the land behind it. The Atmarans chose high ground. This was instinct shaped by long experience. High ground means you can see what is coming before it arrives. It means attackers have to climb toward you. It means the wind hits you before it hits anyone below, which matters when you need to smell smoke from an enemy fire or hear ships approaching in fog. The great arch of rock that Solitude now stands on would have been noticed immediately by Atmoran eyes as a defensible position. It rises above everything around it. It overlooks the water. It has only limited approaches. Whether early Atmoran settlers used it directly or simply recognized its value, that arch was never going to be ignored by people who thought the way they did. The first structures the Atmorans built in Halfingar were nothing like the carved stone longhouses that later Nordic architecture became known for. Early Atmoran construction was practical and fast. Wood came first, timber frames packed with whatever insulating material was close at hand. Turf, packed earth, animal hides stretched over frames. The goal was shelter from the wind and cold, not permanence. These early buildings would have sat low to the ground. Small openings, heavy doors, fires burning inside almost constantly. Nothing about them announced wealth or power. They were the buildings of people who were not yet sure they were staying. Over time, as the Atmaran settlers grew more confident in their hold on the land, the structures changed. Stone replaced wood. Walls grew thicker. The buildings began to climb rather than crouch. But in the earliest years, on the Halfingar coast, everything was temporary, built to last one winter at a time. The conflicts with the snow elves did not begin all at once. They built slowly. The Atmarans pushed further from their landing points as their numbers grew. They needed more land for more people. The snow elves pulled back, at first by choice, then by force. Skirmishes happened along the boundaries of contested ground. The high cliffs and wooded areas of Halfingar became places where two peoples moved around each other, with increasing hostility. The Atmorans had a specific advantage. They kept getting reinforced. More ships came from Atmora. More people arrived on the coast. The snow elf population of Halfingar was fixed. They could not call for more of their kind from across a sea. Every conflict that cost them people was a loss they could not replace at the same rate. The balance shifted slowly, but it only ever shifted one direction. The Atmoran settlers developed leadership structures quickly on the new coast. A group crossing a dangerous sea and landing in contested territory needs someone to make decisions fast. The early Atmoran leaders in Halfingar were not kings in any formal sense. They were the strongest voices, the ones who had proven themselves on the crossing or in early conflicts with the snow elves. Decisions were made by those who had earned the right to make them through action. This was the foundation of what eventually became Nordic political culture, leadership tied to demonstrated strength rather than inherited title. The Jarls of later Skyrim history carried this idea forward, even after the forms changed completely. The first leaders who stood on the Halfingar cliffs and decided where to build and who to fight were not so different in spirit from the Jarls who came thousands of years after them. The Merethic era does not have clean dates. It is not a period you can pin to a number. It is simply the long stretch of time before records began, before anyone was writing things down in a way that survived. What happened on the Halfingar coast during those early Atmaran years exists now only in fragments. A line in an old text, a reference in a later song, the shape of a ruin that does not quite match anything built afterward. The Atmarans who landed there did not know they were beginning something that would last thousands of years. They were just cold people looking for solid ground. They found it on a coastline that someone else already called home. And the world that grew from that landing, slowly, over more generations than anyone counted, eventually became the city that stands on the Great Arch today. The ships are long gone. The sea is the same. The dragons did not rule Skyrim from the sky alone. They ruled through men, specific men, chosen, elevated, and given power that set them apart from every other person alive. These were the dragon priests, and during the height of their authority, no corner of Skyrim was free from their reach. Not the southern holds, not the mountain passes, and not the cold coastal cliffs of Harfingar. The priests were everywhere the dragons wanted them to be. And for a long time, the people living along that shore had no choice but to obey. In the early First Era, the age when the dragon cult held real political power across Skyrim, the priests functioned as governors as much as religious figures. They did not simply perform rituals and give blessings. They collected tribute. They issued orders. They decided which settlements could grow and which ones would be kept small and dependent. A dragon priest assigned to the Harfingar region would have controlled the coastal settlements with the same authority a Jarl held in later centuries. The people living there farmed, fished, and built, and a portion of everything they produced moved upward to the priest, not as a gift, as an obligation. The cult did not frame this as exploitation. It framed it as the natural order of the world. The dragons were above everything. The priests served the dragons. The people served the priests. The system was presented as simply the way things were. What the dragon cult demanded from coastal populations was specific. Food was the most obvious: grain, dried fish, preserved meat to supply whatever structure the priest maintained in the region. But the cult also demanded labor. The great Nordic structures associated with dragon priest activity were not built by magic. They were built by people who had no say in the matter. Stone had to be cut and carried. Walls had to be raised. The elaborate burial systems that dragon priests used, the word walls, the sealed chambers, the layered crypts, required enormous amounts of organized human work. The people of Harfingar's coast contributed to that work, whether they wanted to or not. Some of them likely believed in what they were building. Others simply worked because refusing was not a real option. The priests had dragons behind them. That ended most arguments before they started. The ruins near Harfingar still carry dragon priest connections today. Wolf Skull Cave sits in the hills west of Solitude. Its name comes from the Nordic past, but its deeper history connects to older cult activity in the region. The cave system shows signs of ritual use that predate its later history as a necromancer site. Shriekwind Bastion lies further south in the Harfingar Hold, a place where dragon cult presence shaped the original construction before time, and later occupants changed its purpose. These sites are not coincidences. The dragon cult placed its structures deliberately, on high ground, near water, at points that gave visibility over surrounding territory. Harfingar's geography made it valuable. The priests who operated in this region chose their positions the same way the Atmoran settlers had. From the high places, you could see everything coming. The site where the Bards College now stands in Solitude carries a quiet question beneath it. The college occupies one of the oldest continuously used pieces of ground in the city. Its position, elevated, central, overlooking the main approaches to Solitude, matches the kind of placement the dragon cult favored for its regional centers. Some players have noted that the college's deep basement levels and its oldest stone sections do not match Imperial or even late Nordic construction styles. The architecture in those lower areas is older, heavier, built with a different intention than education or music. Whether the Bards College site was once used for dragon cult purposes is not confirmed by the game, but the ground it sits on was occupied long before any bard ever stood in it. What happened on that specific piece of high rock before the songs began is something the college's own records do not clearly explain. The dragon priests themselves were not ordinary people who rose through religious ranks. They were chosen. The lore suggests the most powerful priests were selected in youth and shaped deliberately for the role, trained in the Thuum, the voice, and in whatever magical disciplines the dragons found useful. By the time a priest reached full authority, they were something genuinely separate from the people they governed. Their masks, the ornate, enchanted coverings that identified their rank, were not decorative. They were functional tools of power. A dragon priest operating in Harfingar would have been a figure that coastal Nord communities both relied on and feared. He controlled access to resources. He spoke with the authority of dragons. He existed at a distance from ordinary life that made him feel less like a person and more like a fixed feature of the world, like the cliffs themselves, or the cold water below them. The collapse of the dragon cult did not happen slowly. It broke fast. The rebellion against dragon rule, led by figures like Hakon One-Eye, Gormlaith Golden Hilt, and Feldir the Old, moved through Skyrim with the momentum of people who had been waiting for permission to push back. When the dragons lost their hold, the priests lost theirs too. In Halfingr, the collapse would have been felt quickly. The tributes stopped. The labor demands stopped. The authority that had organized coastal life for generations simply ceased to function. For the people living there, this was not an uncomplicated relief. The cult had been the structure around which everything was organized. When it fell, there was no replacement system waiting. The settlements along the Halfingr coast had to figure out how to govern themselves without the framework that had defined their lives. Some managed it, some did not. The years immediately after the cult's collapse were quiet but uncertain. The dragon priests did not accept their fall peacefully. The ones who were not killed in the rebellion were sealed away. Their bodies were interred in elaborate burial systems, word walls, locked chambers, undead guardians set to protect them through whatever came after. The priests buried near Halfingr went into the ground still wearing their masks. Their power did not vanish with their breath. It simply went still. The enchantments on their masks kept working. Their connection to whatever magic sustained them continued in a reduced form. The burial sites near Halfingr became places that local populations avoided. Not because of any formal prohibition, because the feeling around those places did not change after the priests were sealed inside. Something in the stone of those old structures still felt occupied. Centuries passed, the cult was forgotten. The ruins remained, and the priests inside them waited with the particular patience of things that are not entirely dead. What the dragon cult left behind in Halfingr was not just ruins. It left a shape in the culture. The Nordic people who came after the cult's collapse inherited a deep suspicion of concentrated religious authority. The Jarls who rose to power in the holds after the cult fell were careful not to position themselves the way the priests had. Power in post-cult Nordic society was supposed to be visible, accountable, and tied to the people it governed, not elevated above them and backed by something unchallengeable. This was a direct reaction to what the dragon cult had done. The priests had held too much. They had asked for too much. And when the people finally said no, they said it in a way that shaped Nordic political thinking for the rest of Skyrim's history. The great arch above the cold sea eventually held a city built on different principles. But the memory of what had stood on that high ground before, demanding, distant, and permanent, never fully left the stone. The Daedric princes do not live in time. They exist beside it. While kingdoms rise and fall and entire civilizations vanish from the surface of Tamriel, the princes simply continue. They were present before the first Nordic ship crossed the Sea of Ghosts. They will be present long after the last stone of solitude crumbles into the water below. Most of them watch mortal life with a kind of distant curiosity, interested, but not invested. Meridia is different. She has opinions, strong ones, and one of those opinions concerns the dead. Meridia rules a plane of oblivion called the Coloured Rooms. The name alone sets it apart from the other Daedric realms. Molag Bal rules Cold Harbour, a grey, crushed version of Nirn drained of everything warm. Mehrunes Dagon rules the Deadlands, fire and ruin in every direction. But Meridia's realm is described in the lore as something filled with light. Not harsh light, not burning light, a clean, steady light that fills every corner of the space without shadow. The coloured rooms are associated with the energy of living things, the specific warmth that exists in a body that is still breathing, still thinking, still moving through the world with purpose. Meridia values that energy above almost everything else. She collects it, she protects it, and she has an absolute hatred for anything that takes living energy and twists it into something hollow and cold. That hatred is why she despises undeath. A zombie, a draugr, a vampire, a skeleton raised by a necromancer. These are, in Meridia's view, an offense against the fundamental nature of existence. Living energy is meant to move forward. It is meant to pass on when a body is finished. When a necromancer pulls that energy back and locks it into a dead body, they are not creating life. They are trapping something that was supposed to be free. Meridia finds this repellent in a way that goes beyond simple preference. It is theological. It is core to everything she believes about what existence is for. Most Daedric princes collect mortal souls or manipulate mortal lives for their own purposes. Meridia's position on the undead makes her unusual. She is not protecting mortals out of kindness exactly. She is protecting the integrity of living energy itself. The distinction matters to her, even if it is difficult for mortals to fully understand. Kilcreath Temple sits on a high hill in the Halfingar Hold, west of Solitude, along the coastal cliffs. Meridia chose this location deliberately. The lore around Daedric shrines suggests the princes do not place their temples randomly. They choose sites that have meaning, geographical, spiritual, or historical significance that aligns with their particular domain. Kilcreath's elevation gives it a clear view of the surrounding land and the sea beyond. Light reaches it from multiple directions. On clear days, the sun hits the temple from morning through late afternoon. For a prince whose realm is defined by light and whose power is connected to radiant energy, a high coastal site with maximum sun exposure is not a coincidence. Meridia placed her beacon there because the location itself resonated with what she values. The temple is a physical expression of her presence in the world, elevated, bright, and pointed outward toward everything around it. Malcaron was a powerful warlock who took over Kilcreath Temple during the Fourth Era. He was not a servant of Meridia. He was a man who found a useful location and decided it belonged to him. During the chaos following the Great War between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion, Malcaron used the temple as a base for his necromantic work. He raised the dead soldiers of that war, men who had died fighting and whose energy had not yet fully passed on, and bound them into service inside the temple. This was exactly the kind of thing Meridia cannot tolerate. Her own sacred site, filled with the specific corruption she has dedicated her existence to opposing. The desecration was not subtle. The temple's light dimmed. The beacon Meridia had placed there went dark. And the prince whose realm is built on radiant energy found herself locked out of her own house by a man raising corpses in her front hall. What Meridia asks of mortals is direct and specific. She does not offer long philosophical tests or complicated riddles the way some Daedric princes do. She identifies a problem, she finds a mortal capable of solving it, and she gives them a tool and a task. In the case of Kilcreath, she gives the Dragonborn her beacon, a concentrated form of her light, and asks them to carry it through the temple, restore the light to each of its chambers, and destroy Malcaran. The request is practical. The reward she offers is Dawnbreaker, a sword built entirely around the destruction of undead. It explodes undead enemies with light on a killing blow. It is one of the most specifically designed weapons in the game, made for exactly one purpose by a prince who has exactly one obsession. Meridia does not give Dawnbreaker as a gift for good behavior. She gives it as a tool for continuing her work after the Dragonborn walks away from the temple. The theological question that Meridia raises is one the game never fully answers. Can a Daedric prince be good? The Divines, Akatosh, Talos, Kynareth, and the others are the gods that Nord and imperial culture considers moral and trustworthy. The Daedric princes are generally considered dangerous, unpredictable, and self-serving. Worshipping them is illegal in the Empire. Their shrines are hidden. Their followers are viewed with suspicion. But Meridia opposes undeath. She restores light to corrupted places. She arms mortals against necromancers. By the standard of outcomes, her interventions in the mortal world tend to leave things better than she found them. Some players argue this makes her the closest thing to a genuinely good Daedric prince in the entire game. Others point out that her methods are not gentle. She is commanding, cold, and entirely certain she is right. Helping her because her goals align with yours is not the same as her being trustworthy. The game holds both possibilities open and does not choose between them. Meridia's relationship with mortals is not warm. She does not speak to the Dragonborn the way a friend speaks. She speaks from above, literally, in the game, lifting the player into the air when she communicates. Her tone is not cruel, but it is not kind either. It is the tone of something that considers itself fundamentally more important than the person it is addressing. She uses mortals as instruments. She is honest about this in the way that someone is honest when they do not think honesty costs them anything. She will tell you what she needs, give you what you require to get it done, and acknowledge your service when it is complete. But she will not pretend the relationship is equal. In this way, She is more straightforward than many of the other princes, who dress their manipulation in layers of charm or deception. Meridia simply tells you what she wants. Whether that makes her better or worse than the others is a question the lore leaves quietly unanswered. The light inside Kilcreath Temple, once restored, is steady and clean. It fills every room without flickering. It does not cast dramatic shadows. It simply illuminates. Standing in that restored temple after Malcheron is gone, the space feels like something that has returned to its correct state, not transformed, just corrected. That quality of quiet restoration is very much in keeping with what Meridia represents. She is not interested in grand gestures or dramatic change. She is interested in light being where light belongs, and darkness being pushed back to wherever it came from. The coloured rooms that she rules reflect the same principle. Everything in its right place. Everything alive staying alive. Everything dead staying gone. It is a simple philosophy for a being of enormous power. And on the cold cliffs of Harfingar, in a temple that looks out over the grey sea, her light keeps burning long after the Dragonborn has moved on to other things. Some cities are built where people happen to stop. Others are built where the land itself demands a city exist. Solitude is the second kind. The great arch of rock it stands on is not a foundation someone chose from a list of options. It is a geological feature so specific, so defensively perfect, and so visually dominant over everything around it, that the only real question is not why someone built a city there, but why it took as long as it did. The arch that Solitude stands on is older than any civilization in Skyrim. It formed long before the first snow elf walked the Harfingar coast, long before the first Atmoran ship crossed the Sea of Ghosts. The arch is a natural limestone formation shaped by thousands of years of water erosion. The Sea of Ghosts eats at the base of the Harfingar cliffs constantly. Waves push into cracks in the rock. Frost widens those cracks every winter. Over an enormous span of time, the softer sections of the cliff face dissolve and collapse while the harder sections remain. What is left, after all that slow erosion, is exactly what Solitude stands on. A hardened spine of rock projecting out from the cliff, elevated above the water, connected to the mainland on one end and open to the air on the other. The arch did not appear suddenly. It was shaped by the sea across a timeline that makes human history look brief. The geological position of the arch gave it military value that any experienced fighter would recognize immediately. The approach from the landward side is narrow. An enemy force moving towards Solitude from inland has to compress into a smaller and smaller front as the ground narrows toward the arch connection point. A small number of defenders holding that narrow approach can stop a much larger force from advancing. On the seaward side, the drop from the arch to the water below is significant. No force is climbing those cliffs under combat conditions. The arch itself has only the one serious approach, and whoever controls that approach controls the city completely. Early Nordic kings understood this, the way people understand things that are obvious once you see them. High ground with one entrance is not just a good position. In the First Era, when warfare between holds was constant and the political map of Skyrim shifted every generation, it was the best position available on the entire northern coast. Before the first Nordic walls went up on the arch, the ground up there was not empty. The Snow Elves had known about that formation for as long as they had lived on the Harfingar coast. A high point overlooking the sea and the surrounding land is exactly the kind of place a settled people uses for observation, ritual, or storage. There is no confirmed lore stating the Snow Elves built permanent structures on the arch, but the carved stone and worn surfaces that predate any Nordic construction in the area suggest the arch was used long before the Nords arrived. When the first Atmoran settlers moved through Harfingar and eventually displaced the Snow Elves, the arch would have been one of the first high-value positions they identified. Whatever had been there before them was cleared away, or built over. The first Nordic presence on the arch was probably not a city. It was a watchtower. A watchtower on the arch made immediate practical sense. The Sea of Ghosts was the primary avenue of approach for anything coming from the north. Ships from Atmora, potential raiders, unknown vessels, all of them would appear on the water before they appeared on land. A watchtower on the arch gave Harfingar's early Nordic population several hours of warning before any seaborne threat reached the coast. That warning time was the difference between a community that could organize a defense and one that was caught completely unprepared. The first structure on the arch was almost certainly built for this single purpose, to see what was coming before it arrived. It would have been simple. Stone walls, a fire platform at the top, a small shelter for the people stationed there. Nothing about it would have suggested that this same piece of ground would one day hold the largest city in Skyrim. The watchtower became a garrison over time. As Harfingar's Nordic population grew and early hold structures began to develop across Skyrim in the First Era, the arch became a military base rather than just an observation post. A garrison needs more than a fire platform. It needs housing for soldiers, storage for weapons and food, a command structure, and eventually a space where the person giving orders can live and work. These needs added buildings to the arch, one by one. Each addition made the next one more logical. Once you have soldiers stationed somewhere permanently, you need people to supply them: traders, craftspeople, cooks. Once you have traders, you have a market. Once you have a market, you have a settlement. The arch grew from a watchtower to a garrison to a small fortified town, without any single person deciding that was what it was going to become. It simply followed the logic of its own usefulness. The decision to make the arch settlement the seat of Harfingar's hold authority was partly practical and partly political. Practically, the Jarl who controlled the arch controlled the most defensible position on the coast. Moving the center of hold power there meant the Jarl was always in the safest location available. Politically, ruling from the highest and most visible point in the region sent a message that did not require words. Every ship that passed along the Harfingar coast could see the settlement on the arch. Every traveller approaching from inland could see it from miles away. Power in the First Era was partly about visibility. Being seen in the right place said something about who you were and what you controlled. A Jarl ruling from the Arch of Harfingar was ruling from a position that announced itself to everything around it. That combination of physical security and visual authority made the arch the natural centre of hold power. No other location in Harfingar could offer both at once. Beneath the city that eventually grew on the arch, the geology created something that Nordic builders found useful and later populations largely forgot. Limestone formations like the arch naturally develop internal cavities over time. The same water erosion that shaped the arch from the outside worked on the inside too, creating hollow spaces within the rock. The Nords who built the early city on the arch discovered these cavities and used them. Storage rooms cut into the living rock. Passages connecting different parts of the settlement through the interior of the arch itself, rather than across its exposed surface. Drainage systems that used natural channels in the stone to move water away from inhabited areas. These underground features were practical additions to an already practical settlement. Over centuries of construction above ground, the lower levels were built over, forgotten, or sealed. The city grew upward, and the spaces beneath it accumulated layers of history that the surface never showed. The harbour below the arch completed the picture of why Solitude became what it became. The arch sits above a natural harbour, formed by the shape of the coastline and the protection of the cliffs. Ships anchoring below the arch are sheltered from the worst of the northern winds. The harbour is deep enough for large vessels. The approach from the sea is clear of the worst rocks. For a city on top of the arch, the harbour below was not a separate feature, it was an extension of the same strategic position. The city controlled the high ground and the water access simultaneously. Trade coming in by sea had to pass under the arch to reach the harbour. Military threats coming by sea faced the same position. No other location on the Harfingar coast combined elevation, single approach land defence, and a functional harbour in the same place. Solitude was not the capital of Harfingar because someone decided it should be. It was the capital because the geography made every other option a worse choice. The city that stands on the arch today is layered in ways that most visitors never think about. The imperial architecture visible throughout modern Solitude sits on top of older Nordic construction. That older Nordic construction sits on top of the earliest garrison buildings. Those garrison buildings sit on top of the original watchtower footprint. And beneath all of it, in the limestone interior of the arch itself, the natural cavities and carved passages of a dozen different periods of use sit in varying states of preservation and neglect. Some of these lower spaces connect to the catacombs that extend into the cliff behind the arch. Others dead-end in sealed walls that no current resident of Solitude knows how to open. The city above is busy and visible and present. The city below is quiet, dark, and very old. Both are solitude. The arch holds them together without distinguishing between them, stone carrying everything that was ever placed on it with the same indifferent patience it has held for longer than any name given to the place above. The Second Era brought many things to Skyrim. New empires, new alliances, new wars between holds that had been fighting each other for generations. But it also brought something that the northern coast had never seen before. Ships from the east, carrying warriors that no Nord legend had prepared anyone for. The Akaviri came from across a distant sea. They did not come to trade. They did not come to settle. They came to take and to move and to leave destruction behind them like a signature. The Halfingar coastline felt their presence, and the marks they left did not disappear when the ships finally stopped coming. The Akaviri were not a single unified people. The continent of Akavir, far to the east across the sea, contained multiple distinct civilizations. The ones who raided Skyrim's northern coast during the Second Era were primarily the Saesai, a serpent folk whose exact nature the lore describes with deliberate uncertainty. Some texts describe them as snake-like beings who consumed the men of Akavir entirely. Other texts suggest they were more humanoid than that, with serpentine features, rather than full serpent bodies. The game does not settle this question cleanly. What it does confirm is that the Saesai were disciplined, organized, and militarily capable in ways that surprised the Nordic holds they encountered. They were not raiders in the simple sense. They operated with strategy. They identified valuable targets. They hit those targets with coordinated force. The northern coast of Skyrim, with its harbors and its trade routes, was exactly the kind of target they were looking for. What the Akaviri forces targeted along the Halfingar coastline followed a clear pattern. Harbors first. Any settlement with a functional dock or natural anchorage was a priority. The harbor below Solitude's Arch was one of the finest natural anchorages on Skyrim's northern coast. It was sheltered, deep, and capable of holding large numbers of ships. For a force that moved primarily by sea, controlling that harbor, even temporarily, gave enormous logistical advantage. Beyond the harbor, the Akaviri targeted supply stores, grain, preserved food, weapons, materials that could sustain a moving military force. The coastal settlements of Halfingar had accumulated these stores over generations of trade. They were exactly what a raiding force needed to keep moving without relying on long supply lines from a distant home base. The Akaviri were not simply destructive. They were extractive. They took what they needed and moved on. Solitude's elevated position on the arch created a specific dynamic during the Akaviri raids. The harbor below could be reached and controlled by sea, but the city above sat on its high arch with its single narrow land approach. Taking Solitude's upper city required either a long siege or a direct assault up that narrow approach under fire from defenders above. Neither option was attractive for a force that valued mobility and speed. The Akaviri could hold the harbor. They could control the water access. They could cut off trade and incoming supplies. But the city itself, perched on its arch above the chaos below, was genuinely difficult to crack by direct assault. This created a strange situation during at least one period of Akaviri activity in the region. The harbor busy with foreign ships, the city above sealed and waiting, neither side able to fully resolve the standoff quickly. The arch that made Solitude a capital also made it stubbornly resistant to the kind of fast, mobile warfare the Akaviri preferred. Nord legends about the Akaviri raids developed their own character along the Halfingar coast. The Saesai, with their serpentine descriptions in foreign texts, translated in local Nordic oral tradition into something more vivid and more monstrous. Stories passed down through generations in Halfingar described snake men rising from the eastern sea, figures with human intelligence and serpent bodies who moved through the water as easily as through air. These legends borrowed from older Nordic folklore about sea creatures and coastal dangers, merging the real historical memory of Akaviri raids with the older Nord tradition of giving sea threats a monstrous shape. By the time these stories had passed through several generations of retelling, the Akaviri and Halfingar legend bore only a loose resemblance to the disciplined military force that had actually appeared on the coast. But the emotional truth of the legend, something powerful and strange, came from the eastern sea and threatened everything, was accurate enough to survive as cultural memory long after the specific details blurred. The Akaviri cultural traces left behind in the Halfingar region after the raids ended were subtle but real. The Akaviri, despite being raiders and invaders in Skyrim's north, carried with them a sophisticated material culture. Their weapons were different from Nordic ones, curved blades designed for specific fighting techniques that Nordic smiths had not previously encountered. Some of those blade designs filtered into northern Nordic smithing traditions after the raids ended, not through peaceful exchange, but through the simple fact that captured or abandoned Akaviri weapons were studied by Nordic craftspeople who recognized quality when they saw it. The curved sword tradition that appears in later Skyrim history carries faint traces of that Akaviri influence. The raiders left their mark on the tools of the people who outlasted them. The Akaviri raids reshaped how Solitude thought about its harbour. Before the raids, the harbour below the arch was primarily a trade asset, a place where goods arrived and departed, where merchants anchored their ships, where the economic life of the hold connected to the wider world. After experiencing what a hostile force could do with control of that harbour, Solitude's leadership began thinking about it differently. The harbour needed to be defensible as well as functional. This meant permanent military vessels. It meant fortified positions along the harbour approaches. It meant a standing naval presence that could challenge foreign ships before they reached the anchorage. The East Empire Company, that later dominated Solitude's harbour, built on infrastructure that was originally developed for military purposes in response to Akaviri pressure. The trade empire that Solitude eventually became had its roots partly in the defensive thinking forced on the city by raiders who came from the east. The end of the major Akaviri incursions into Skyrim came not through Nordic military victory in the traditional sense, but through the emergence of Remen Cyrodiil, a figure who united opposition to the Akaviri and eventually absorbed many of them into an imperial military structure. For the Halfingar coast, the withdrawal of serious Akaviri raiding pressure was gradual rather than sudden. Ships became less frequent, the raids became smaller and less organized. Eventually, the eastern threat that had reshaped Solitude's relationship with its own harbour faded into background noise and then into memory. The city above the arch had survived. The harbour below had survived. Both were different for the experience. The Nord communities along the Halfingar coast emerged from the Akaviri period with a permanent wariness about the sea that had not been there before, a knowledge that the water which fed them and connected them to the world could also deliver something they were not ready for. The memory of the Akaviri raids settled into Halfingar's identity in a way that outlasted the specific events. Solitude became a city that took its naval position seriously. The harbour was maintained, expanded, and eventually turned into one of the most important trade ports in all of Skyrim. But underneath the trade prosperity, the original reason for that naval focus never fully disappeared. The Akaviri had demonstrated that a city controlling the high ground above a harbour could hold out against forces that controlled the water below. Solitude drew the correct lesson. Controlling both was better than controlling either one alone. The city that eventually dominated northern Skyrim's trade did so from a position of genuine military security. The arch above and the harbour below worked together. The raiders from the Eastern Sea had, in a way, taught Solitude exactly what it needed to learn to become what it eventually became. There is no era for this chapter. The Daedric princes exist outside of time. Soul mechanics exist outside of time. The nature of what a soul is, where it goes, and what can be done to it, these questions sit beside history rather than inside it. They were true before the First Kingdom rose. They remain true after the last one falls. Soul gems sit in every shop in Solitude, glowing faintly on wooden shelves between potions and armor pieces. Most people who pick one up think of it as a tool, a battery, something useful for enchanting a sword or filling a staff. Very few people stop to think about what is actually inside it, or whether that thing inside it knows where it is. A soul gem works by capturing the life force of a living creature at the moment of death. When a mage casts Soul Trap on a target, they are creating a container relationship between the dying creature and the gem. The moment the creature dies while the spell is active, its soul, the animating force that made it a living thing, is drawn out of the body and sealed inside the gem. The body stays behind. The soul goes somewhere small and dark and crystalline. The gem closes around it. The process is fast. The lore does not describe it as painful in any text that survives. But the lore also does not describe it from the perspective of the thing being trapped. The mechanics are explained from the outside. What happens on the inside is a question the game raises quietly and then steps away from without answering. What happens to a consciousness inside a filled soul gem is one of the most genuinely unsettling questions in Elder Scrolls lore. The soul gems used for most everyday enchanting contain animal souls, wolves, deer, fish, creatures whose inner experience, if they have one, is presumably limited. But the game makes a careful distinction between these common white soul gems and the black soul gems that can contain human and elven souls. This distinction exists in the lore for a reason. Human and mer souls are categorized differently. They are considered grand souls, not just because of their size and power, but because of what they contain. A level of consciousness, memory, and selfhood that animal souls do not carry in the same way. When a black soul gem traps a human soul, it is trapping something that had a name, something that had memories, something that, at the moment the spell took hold, may have understood exactly what was happening to it. White soul gems and black soul gems are not just different in size. They represent a moral and legal division that the Empire takes seriously. White soul gems, filled with animal souls, are legal, common, and sold openly in every magic shop in Skyrim. Black soul gems are illegal under Imperial law. Possessing one marks a person as someone engaged in practices the Empire considers deeply criminal. The reason for this legal distinction is not arbitrary. It reflects a theological and ethical position that human and elven souls belong to the divines, that they are destined for Aetherius after death, and that capturing them in a gem is an interruption of a process that is supposed to be sacred. Necromancers use black soul gems. Practitioners of forbidden magic use them. The College of Winterhold officially discourages their use, even when it does not always enforce that discouragement consistently. The gems themselves sit in the world as small crystalline objects that represent an enormous ethical weight. The soul cairn is where things get genuinely quiet and heavy. The soul cairn is a plane of oblivion, a realm outside of the normal world that exists specifically as a repository for souls that have been captured, bartered, or otherwise removed from their expected path. When a soul gem is used for enchanting, the soul inside it is consumed as fuel. Where does it go? Some lore suggests it simply ceases in any meaningful sense. The energy disperses. But the soul cairn complicates this. It is a place that can be visited in the game. It is filled with the remnants of souls, figures that move slowly through a grey landscape, aware enough to speak, diminished enough that they can barely remember what they once were. The souls in the soul cairn are not at peace. They are not suffering dramatically. They are simply reduced, existing in a state that is neither the Aetherius they were meant for, nor the complete ending that death should have provided. They are somewhere in between. Caught, waiting, mostly forgotten. The beings who control the soul cairn are called the Ideal Masters. They are ancient entities whose original nature is debated in the lore, once mortal sorcerers possibly, who sought immortality and found it by transforming themselves into something that feeds on captured souls. The Ideal Masters made deals with mortals across history. They offered power, knowledge, or extended life in exchange for souls delivered to the cairn. These were not always unwilling souls. Some mortals agreed to the exchange knowingly, trading the souls of others, or eventually their own, for whatever the Ideal Masters offered. The soul cairn filled over time with the results of these transactions. Every soul in that grey landscape represents an agreement made somewhere, at some point, by someone who decided the trade was worth making. The Ideal Masters collected their end of every bargain. The souls arrived and stayed. The cairn grew. The ethical question at the center of soul gem use is one the game places in front of the player without ever forcing a conclusion. You need soul gems to enchant your equipment. Enchanting is one of the most useful skills in the game. The system practically encourages you to soul trap everything you kill. The mechanics make it efficient and rewarding. But the lore, running quietly underneath those mechanics, keeps raising the same uncomfortable point. Something is inside that gem, and you are about to burn it to make your sword hit harder. For animal souls, most players make peace with this quickly. For human souls trapped in black gems, the game is less comfortable about it. NPCs who deal in black soul gems are coded as villains or morally compromised figures. The college distances itself from the practice. The Empire made it illegal. The game never tells you that using a black soul gem makes you a bad person. It simply makes sure you know what you are doing when you do it. Soul gems also raise a question about what a soul actually is in the Elder Scrolls universe. In most religious and philosophical traditions within the game, the soul is the essential self, the part of a person that persists after the body is gone and moves toward whatever afterlife their faith promises. The Divines are said to receive the souls of their followers in Aetherius. Sovngarde receives the souls of worthy Nords. Sithis receives the souls of those who serve the Dark Brotherhood. Each tradition has a destination. Soul trapping interrupts the journey to that destination. The soul that ends up in a gem was headed somewhere. The gem stopped it mid-travel. The ideal masters of the soul cairn built an entire realm out of intercepted journeys. Every filled soul gem in a Solitude shop represents a path that was cut short before it reached wherever it was going. The shopkeeper smiles. The gem glows faintly. The path inside it goes nowhere. The quiet truth about soul gems is that the game trusts you to sit with the discomfort rather than resolving it for you. The mechanics say use them. The lore says think about what you are using. Most players learn to hold both of those things at once without needing an answer. This is, in its way, a very Elder Scrolls approach to a moral question. The world is full of systems that work smoothly on the surface and carry weight underneath that the surface does not show. Soul gems are small. They fit in a pocket. They glow with a soft internal light that is almost pretty. And inside that light, in whatever state the lore allows for something caught between death and Aetherius, something persists. Quietly, in the dark of a crystal, in a shop in Solitude, on a shelf between a healing potion and a pair of boots. The Riemann Empire never fully conquered Skyrim. The Nordic holds resisted formal absorption in a way that other parts of Tamriel did not. But resistance to conquest is not the same as isolation. The Riemann Empire was large, organized, and economically powerful in ways that changed the regions around it, even when it did not formally control them. Trade does not stop at political borders. Ideas do not stop at political borders. And the wealth of the Riemann Empire flowed north toward Halfingr in ways that shaped the city long before any imperial governor ever set foot on the Arch. The Second Era was the period when Solitude first began to understand what it meant to be connected to something larger than Skyrim. The Riemann Empire rose in the Second Era under Riemann Cyrodiil, a figure whose origins carry mythological weight in the lore. He united the human kingdoms of Cyrodiil and eventually extended imperial authority across most of Tamriel. His empire was not built purely on military conquest. It was built on a combination of force, diplomacy, and the practical appeal of being part of a large, stable trading network. Regions that joined the Riemann sphere of influence gained access to goods, roads, and protections that standing outside it could not provide. For the Nordic holds of Skyrim, which had spent generations fighting each other in small territorial conflicts, the Riemann Empire represented something genuinely new. A southern neighbor powerful enough to make cooperation more attractive than confrontation. At least some of the time. The trade networks of the Riemann Empire extended toward Halfingr through a combination of sea routes and overland paths that connected Cyrodiil to Skyrim's southern holds, and eventually to the northern coast. Solitude's harbour made it a natural endpoint for northern sea trade. Ships that moved goods up the western coast of Tamriel from imperial ports found Solitude's harbour a logical final stop before turning back south. The goods that arrived through this trade were not luxuries exclusively, though imperial luxury goods did reach Solitude during this period. They were also practical materials, better quality iron and steel, agricultural products from the warmer south, preserved foods that did not exist in Skyrim's cold climate, textiles, tools. The arrival of these goods through Riemann-era trade networks raised the material standard of life in Halfingr measurably. The city's population grew, its market expanded, its merchants began to think of trade with the south as a permanent feature of life rather than an occasional opportunity. Riemann-era diplomacy with Skyrim's Jarls operated on a specific principle. The Empire preferred to make Nordic rulers feel respected rather than subordinate. Riemann Cyrodiil himself was known for recognizing the particular pride of Nordic political culture and working with it rather than against it. Ambassadors sent north did not arrive with demands for submission. They arrived with gifts, with trade proposals, and with the implicit suggestion that a Jarl who cooperated with the Empire would find their position strengthened by the association. The Jarl of Huffingar during the early Riemann period held a position of particular interest to imperial diplomats. Solitude's harbour was strategically valuable to any empire that moved goods by sea. Keeping the Jarl of Huffingar friendly meant keeping that harbour accessible. The diplomacy was practical on both sides. The Jarl gained southern connections and legitimacy. The empire gained reliable harbour access on Skyrim's northern coast. Imperial architectural ideas filtered into Solitude during the Riemann period through the same channels that brought trade goods. Nordic architecture in the early First Era was functional and heavy, thick stone walls, low openings, structures built to survive cold and wind rather than to impress. The imperial building tradition that arrived with Riemann-era contact was different. It valued proportion, decoration, and the organization of space for civic purposes. Colonnaded walkways, arched doorways, buildings arranged around central open spaces rather than built as isolated fortified units. These ideas did not replace Nordic construction immediately. They filtered in slowly, appearing first in the buildings associated with trade and diplomacy, the structures where Solitude's leadership met with imperial representatives, or where wealthy merchants displayed their southern connections. Over generations, these imported architectural ideas merged with Nordic construction tradition into the distinctive style that characterizes Solitude today. Heavy Nordic bones with imperial proportions and decorations sitting on top. Solitude's position made it a point of imperial interest that went beyond simple trade. The Riemann Empire thought strategically about Tamriel's geography. A city controlling the high ground above a natural harbour on Skyrim's northern coast was a military asset as well as an economic one. Imperial military planners during the Riemann period understood that projecting power northward into Skyrim, if that ever became necessary, required secure harbour access. Solitude's Arch was the most defensible harbour position on the northern coast. Keeping it friendly was important. Keeping it dependent on imperial trade was a way of keeping it friendly without the cost of direct military occupation. The Riemann Empire's interest in Solitude was the interest of a large power in a smaller strategic node. Not warm, exactly, but attentive. Solitude appeared on imperial maps during this period, not as a conquered territory, but as a marked relationship. Something to maintain. The goods that arrived through Riemann-era trade changed what Solitude's population ate, wore, and used in daily life. Before significant imperial trade contact, Huffingar's material culture was almost entirely locally produced. What you could make in Skyrim from Skyrim's materials was what you had. The arrival of southern goods through Riemann-era networks introduced alternatives. Spices from Cyrodiil and beyond that changed how food was prepared. Fabrics from warmer climates that Skyrim's wool and fur traditions had not previously encountered. Medical knowledge from imperial healers that supplemented the traditional Nordic approach to injury and illness. These changes were not dramatic transformations. They were quiet additions, new options layered on top of existing practices. But over generations, the population of Solitude that had grown up with access to southern goods was materially different from the population of a century earlier. Richer, in small ways. More connected, less purely Nordic in its daily habits. The fall of the Riemann line changed things for Huffingar in ways that took years to fully feel. The Riemann Empire ended not in open military defeat, but in assassination. The last Riemann emperors were killed by their own Akaviri blades, and the line ended without a clear successor. The centralized imperial system that had maintained the trade networks, diplomatic relationships, and road infrastructure of the empire began to fragment. For Solitude, this meant the reliable southern trade connections that had fueled a century of growth became unreliable. Ships still came north, but less regularly. The imperial goods that Solitude's market had come to depend on arrived in smaller quantities at less predictable intervals. Merchants who had built their businesses around the assumption of stable southern supply found that assumption no longer held. The city did not collapse. It adapted. But the adaptation was uncomfortable, and the memory of what consistent imperial trade had provided made Solitude's leadership permanently interested in restoring that connection whenever the political conditions made it possible. The legacy of Riemann-era contact in Huffingar was a city that had learned to want more than Skyrim alone could provide. This is not a small thing. A city that is satisfied with its local production and its local connections does not develop the kind of outward-looking commercial ambition that Solitude eventually became known for. The exposure to imperial trade networks during the Riemann period taught Solitude's merchant class and its political leadership that the city's real value was not just its arch and its harbour, but its position as a connection point between Skyrim and the wider world. The Riemann Empire had shown them what that connection was worth. When the empire fell and the connection weakened, Solitude spent the next several centuries working to rebuild it under whatever political framework would support it. The East Empire Company that eventually dominated Solitude's harbour was the culmination of an ambition the Riemann period had first made legible to the city. The cold sea was always there. The Riemann Empire taught Solitude to use it properly. The Riemann line ended quietly. No great battle closed it. No final siege or burning city marked the moment it was over. The emperors simply stopped, and the empire they had built began its slow conversion into something else. For the Jarls of Harfingar, who had spent a generation building relationships with imperial diplomats and growing wealthy on imperial trade, the ending of the Riemann period was felt as an absence rather than an event. The ships came less often. The ambassadors stopped arriving. The letters from the south grew infrequent and then stopped. The arch above the cold sea was still there. The harbour was still there. The city was still there. But the larger world it had briefly connected to had folded back into itself, and Solitude was left, for a time, facing the grey water alone. Most rulers leave behind statues, buildings, laws that carry their name for a generation or two, before fading into the general architecture of whoever came next. Potema Septim left behind something different. She left behind herself, not a memory of herself, not a legend shaped by people who half remembered her. She left behind her actual presence, her voice, her will, her fury, sealed into the stone beneath the city she had ruled and refused to release, even after death came for her. Solitude has had many rulers. It has had only one Wolf Queen, and the Wolf Queen did not consider death a sufficient reason to stop. Potema was born in the Third Era as a daughter of the Septim line, the imperial family that had ruled Tamriel since Tiber Septim united the continent centuries before her birth. Being born into the Septim family meant being born into proximity to enormous power, but not necessarily into possession of it. The imperial succession was complicated, contested, and frequently violent. Potema understood this early. She was not a passive figure shaped by the circumstances around her. From a young age, she was politically aware in a way that the people around her found uncomfortable. She watched how power moved. She identified who held it and who only appeared to. She learned the difference between formal authority and actual influence. By the time she was old enough to be useful as a political marriage, she had already developed the particular kind of intelligence that makes people around it nervous, the kind that is always calculating, always patient, and never satisfied with what it currently has. Potema came to rule Solitude through marriage. She was wed to the king of Solitude, Mantiarco, an older man whose health was already failing when the marriage was arranged. The political logic was straightforward. A Septim bride elevated Mantiarco's court and strengthened his hold's connection to the imperial centre. For Potema, the arrangement offered something equally clear: a throne. Not the imperial throne, not yet, but a real seat of power in one of Skyrim's most strategically important cities. She ruled alongside Mantiarco and, as his health declined, increasingly in his place. When he died, Solitude passed to their son, Uriel Mantiarco, but the real power behind the court remained exactly where it had been. Potema did not step back when her husband died. She stepped forward. The throne of Solitude had become an instrument she intended to use for something much larger than governing a northern hold. The War of the Red Diamond was one of the most destructive conflicts in Third Era history. It began as a succession crisis, a dispute over who had the legitimate right to the imperial throne following the death of Emperor Antiochus Septim. Potema's position was that her son Uriel Mantiarco had the strongest claim. She was wrong about this legally, but she was not making a legal argument. She was making a military one. She spent years building alliances, securing agreements with other holds and kingdoms, and assembling the political coalition she needed to press her son's claim by force. When the war began, Potema was not a figure on its edges. She was one of its primary architects, and one of its most dangerous participants. Her strategic intelligence, which had been obvious since her youth, now had the full resources of Solitude and its alliances behind it. She was not fighting for her son exactly. She was fighting for the version of the world she had decided should exist, with herself at its center. Patima's mastery of necromancy was not incidental to her political career. It was integral to it. During the War of the Red Diamond, and in the years before it, she developed her abilities with the dead into something that went far beyond what most practitioners of the art could achieve. She raised armies, not small groups of reanimated soldiers, but organized forces of undead that she commanded with military precision. The lore describes her necromantic abilities as among the most powerful ever recorded in Tamrielic history. She did not simply reanimate bodies and point them at enemies. She maintained complex hierarchies of undead servants, each one held in careful balance by her will and her skill. Beneath Solitude, in the catacombs that ran through the limestone of the arch, she built the physical infrastructure of this practice. Chambers carved for specific ritual purposes, passages designed for the movement of undead forces, spaces that served as the operational center of an army that never needed to sleep or eat or question its orders. The catacombs beneath Solitude are older than Patema. They existed before her, carved partly by natural water erosion, and partly by the hands of earlier Nordic builders who found the hollow spaces in the arch's limestone useful for storage and burial. Patema inherited these spaces and transformed them. She extended existing passages. She sealed off sections that served no military purpose. She created new chambers at lower levels that no ordinary resident of Solitude knew existed. The work was done quietly, over years, using labor that would not talk about what it had built. By the time the War of the Red Diamond was at its height, the catacombs beneath Solitude were not just a burial system. They were a fortified operational space for an army of the dead, maintained by the most powerful necromancer Skyrim had produced in living memory. The city above went about its business. The city below prepared for a war that its living population only partly understood. The War of the Red Diamond did not end the way Patema intended. Her coalition fractured. Military defeats eroded the alliances she had spent years building. Her son's claim was never recognized by enough of the empire to become uncontestable. By the time the conflict wound down, Patema was old, isolated in Solitude, and stripped of most of the external support that had made her dangerous on a continental scale. She did not accept this quietly. She continued her necromantic work. She maintained what she could of her undead forces. She ruled Solitude as an increasingly isolated fortress, her court populated by the dead, and the few living who had not yet found a reason to leave. When she finally died, it was not in battle or by execution. It was in her seat of power, in the city she had refused to leave, surrounded by the armies of the dead she had built and still commanded to the end. Her spirit did not pass on. This is the part that the lore treats as genuinely unusual, even by the standards of a world where unusual things happen regularly. Most people die, and their souls move on, to Aetherius, to Sovngarde, to whatever destination their faith or their deeds have prepared for them. Potema's spirit stayed in the catacombs, not as a simple haunting, not as a mindless echo of a person who once existed, as something that retained her intelligence, her will, and her capacity for action. In the Fourth Era, centuries after her death, her spirit was still active enough to be involved in an attempt to physically restore her, to pull her back from whatever half-state she occupied and return her to a body that could rule again. This required intervention to prevent. The fact that it was possible at all says something significant about what Patema left behind when she died. Whether Patema's presence in the catacombs was entirely her own will, or whether something else anchored her there, is a question the game raises without closing. Her hatred for the people who had defeated her, her refusal to accept the end of her ambitions, her absolute conviction that the world had not yet given her what she was owed, these are all sufficient explanations for a spirit that simply refused to go. But the catacombs she built were not just stone passages. They were ritual spaces, constructed according to necromantic principles she had spent a lifetime studying. It is possible that in building those spaces, she inadvertently or deliberately created an anchor, a physical location whose construction was so deeply tied to her will and her power that her spirit could not separate from it after death, even if some part of her had wanted to. The Wolf Queen who never let go may have been held in place not only by her own refusal, but by the very walls she had raised around herself in life. The city above kept living. The queen below kept waiting, and the limestone of the arch held both of them without distinguishing between the living and the dead. Most institutions in Tamriel announce what they are. The companions train warriors. The College of Winterhold teaches magic. The Thieves' Guild steals things. Their purposes are visible in what they do every day. The Bards College in Solitude is different. It calls itself a school for musicians, poets, and historians. And it is those things. But beneath the lutes and the recited verses and the students practicing chord progressions in drafty hallways, something older runs quietly through the college's foundations. The songs it teaches are not entertainment. They are containers. And what they contain has been kept carefully, deliberately, and sometimes dangerously for longer than most people in Solitude have thought to ask about. The Bards College sits on elevated ground within Solitude, one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in the city. Its position is not accidental. Before the college existed in any formal sense, that ground held structures whose purpose the college's own records do not fully explain. The stonework in the college's lower levels is older than its founding date. The proportions of certain walls and doorways in the deepest parts of the building match neither imperial nor standard Nordic construction. Something was there before the college. What exactly that something was has never been officially investigated by the college itself, which is its own kind of answer. Institutions that are comfortable with their foundations tend to look at them openly. Institutions that avoid looking tend to have a reason. The formal founding of the Bards College belongs to the Third Era, though the exact date is not pinned down cleanly in the law. What the law does establish is that the college was created with a specific dual purpose. On the surface, it existed to preserve and teach the bardic arts, music, poetry, history, and the performance traditions that Nordic culture had carried in oral form for thousands of years. This surface purpose was genuine. The college trained real bards who went out into the world and performed in courts, taverns, and public spaces across Skyrim. But the second purpose, less visible and less advertised, was preservation. The college was established partly as a formal repository for the oral history of the Nordic people, a place where the songs and poems and spoken histories that had survived the transition from the ancient world to the imperial present could be written down, studied, and protected from the particular kind of loss that happens when the last person who knows something dies without passing it on. Nordic oral history, before the Bards College, existed in a precarious state. The ancient Nords did not rely on written records the way the Imperials did. Knowledge was passed through song, through recited verse, through the specific memorized words of stories told from one generation to the next. This system worked reliably when the culture that supported it was stable. But Skyrim had not been stable. The dragon cult's collapse had disrupted cultural transmission. The Atmoran migration itself had broken chains of oral tradition that stretched back to a dying continent. Wars between holds killed the specific people who carried specific stories. By the time the Bards College was formally established, large portions of ancient Nordic oral history existed only in fragments, partial songs, incomplete verses, stories whose beginnings or endings had been lost because the person who knew them had died before passing them on. The college's founding was, among other things, an acknowledgement that what remained needed to be caught before it disappeared entirely. The figures who established the college understood the political dimensions of what they were preserving. Nordic history, as stored in the old songs and poems, was not politically neutral material. It described kings and their deeds in ways that could legitimize or delegitimize current rulers. It carried accounts of battles and alliances that had implications for ongoing territorial disputes. It preserved versions of events that sometimes contradicted the official imperial narrative of how Skyrim had come to be part of the Empire. The founders of the Bards College were not naive about this. They built the college in Solitude, the most imperially aligned city in Skyrim, which gave it a degree of protection from the holds that might have found certain preserved histories threatening. But they also built it with enough independence from direct imperial control to allow the preservation of material that imperial authorities might have preferred to see quietly forgotten. The college walked a careful line from its earliest days, close enough to imperial power to be protected by it, far enough from direct imperial oversight to protect things imperial power would not have approved of. The songs the college guards fall into several categories. The most accessible are the performance pieces, the ballads, the drinking songs, the celebratory verses that bards perform publicly and that anyone can hear in any tavern in Skyrim. These are the visible face of the college's collection. Below them sit the historical narratives, long verse compositions that encode the history of specific Nordic clans, holds, and rulers in a form designed for memorization and transmission. These are taught to advanced students, but not performed publicly. Below those sit the oldest material, fragments of pre-imperial Nordic verse, whose full meaning even the college's senior scholars debate. Some of these fragments are written in forms of Old Nordic that require specialist knowledge to interpret. Others exist in forms that suggest they were not originally written compositions at all, but transcriptions of oral material, whose original performance context has been completely lost. At the very bottom of the collection, in the college's restricted archive, sit the pieces that are not shown to students at standard levels of study. The college has never published a complete catalogue of what it holds in that archive. The reasons given for this restriction have changed over the centuries. The restriction itself has not. The Festival of the Burning of King Olaf is the most visible public expression of the Bards College's relationship with Nordic political history. Every year, the college organises a celebration in Solitude, during which an effigy of King Olaf One-Eye is burned in the city's main square. The official explanation for this festival is that it commemorates a historical injustice. Olaf One-Eye was a high king of Skyrim in the First Era, who, according to the festival's tradition, was a tyrant whose memory deserves to be symbolically destroyed each year. The festival is popular. It involves fire and music and public celebration. Most people who attend it think of it as a colourful tradition with a vague historical justification. The actual history behind it is considerably more complicated. A poem called the Poetic Edda of King Olaf, or more commonly, the verse piece associated with his story, sits at the centre of a political argument that the college has been involved in for generations. The question of whether Olaf One-Eye was actually a tyrant, or whether that characterization was a political construction imposed on him by enemies who outlasted him, is not settled in the law. The festival burns his effigy every year, based on a version of his story that at least some scholars within the college believe is historically inaccurate. The college continues the festival anyway. The reasons for this are political as much as historical. The specific case of the verse piece associated with Olaf One-Eye illuminates something important about how the college handles dangerous material. When the Dragonborn encounters the college in the game, a student named Pantea Atea has recovered a lost verse, the missing piece of the poem about Olaf, and is debating whether to present it publicly. The verse, if authentic, complicates the standard version of Olaf's story in ways that would affect the political justification for the annual burning. The college's response to this situation is revealing. There is internal debate. There is resistance from figures who benefit from the current version of the story. There is a performance eventually, but the institutional discomfort around the whole episode is visible. The college is an organization that has spent generations deciding which versions of history are safe to present publicly and which ones need to stay in the archive. When a piece of evidence surfaces that challenges one of those decisions, the institution does not respond with simple scholarly enthusiasm. It responds the way institutions always respond when evidence threatens comfortable arrangements, carefully, slowly, and with attention to consequences before accuracy. The theory that the Bards College's deepest function is the preservation of the Thuum through song is one of the most quietly persistent ideas in Elder Scrolls fan scholarship. The Thuum, the voice, the dragon shout, is the ancient Nordic power of using specific words to create real effects in the world. During the dragon cult period, this power was practiced openly by the Greybeards and by the dragon priests. After the cult's collapse, the formal practice of the Thuum was restricted. The Greybeards retreated to High Hrothgar and maintained a tradition of careful, meditative practice. Open use of the voice became rare and eventually almost non-existent among ordinary Nords. But the knowledge of the Thuum, the specific words of power, their correct pronunciation, their intended effects, had to go somewhere. Some of it went into the word walls carved in stone across Skyrim. Some of it went with the Greybeards, and some of it, this theory suggests, went into song. The connection between bardic music and the Thuum is not invented by fans from nothing. The lore establishes that the ancient Nords understood sound as inherently powerful. The dragon language is not just a communication system. It is a system in which the correct utterance of a word creates the reality that word describes. Fire is not described by the word for fire. The word for fire creates fire. This understanding of sound as creative force runs through ancient Nordic culture in ways that extend beyond formal Thuum practice. The oldest Nordic songs were not entertainment in origin. They were functional, designed to invoke specific effects, to call on specific powers, to maintain specific connections between the living world and the forces that shaped it. When the Bards College was established and began collecting and preserving ancient Nordic songs, it was collecting material whose original purpose was not performance but invocation. The melodies and rhythms that make the oldest pieces in the college's collection distinctive are not arbitrary artistic choices. They are, according to this theory, the structural preservation of something that could not be safely written down as instruction, but could be hidden inside music in a form that could survive centuries of imperial oversight. The practical implication of this theory is that the Bards College has been maintaining something like a living archive of the voice without ever calling it that. Students who study the oldest pieces in the collection are not told they are learning fragments of the dragon language encoded in musical form. They are told they are studying ancient musical tradition. But the practice of those pieces, the specific intervals, the specific rhythmic patterns, the specific vowel sounds that the oldest compositions require, constitutes a form of rehearsal of sounds that have genuine power in the world. Whether this is deliberate institutional policy or the accumulated result of generations of scholars preserving material they did not fully understand is something the theory does not resolve. Both explanations are consistent with what the college looks like from the outside. An institution can maintain something important without every member of that institution understanding why it is important. The songs continue to be taught. The sounds continue to be practiced. The archive continues to be protected. And the college continues to explain itself as a school for musicians. The relationship between the Bards College and the wider political culture of Solitude in the Third Era was one of managed mutual dependence. The college needed Solitude's protection and resources. Solitude needed the college's services, trained bards for court entertainment, historical legitimization for current rulers, and the cultural prestige that came from hosting the only formal institution of its kind in Skyrim. This dependence gave both parties leverage over the other and created a working relationship that neither side was willing to damage by pushing too hard on the things they disagreed about. The Jarls of Solitude did not ask too many questions about the college's archive. The college did not publicly challenge the Jarls' preferred versions of local history. The Festival of the Burning of King Olaf continued every year as a shared public event that served the political needs of the city while appearing to be purely cultural. Everyone involved understood the arrangement. No one described it openly. This is how old institutions and old power structures tend to work, not through explicit agreement, but through a shared understanding of what questions are not being asked, and why. What the Bards College represents in the context of Solitude's long history is something that cities rarely acknowledge about themselves: the presence of an institution specifically dedicated to deciding what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. Every city has this. The decisions are usually made informally, through the accumulation of what people choose to record and what they choose not to. The Bards College made this process formal and gave it an address. It is an institution whose explicit purpose is the curation of cultural memory. The songs it teaches shape what people know about their own past. The pieces it keeps in its archive and does not teach shape what people do not know. The festival it runs every year reinforces a specific version of a historical figure. This is not corruption exactly. It is the ordinary work of any institution that takes cultural preservation seriously. Choices about what matters, what survives, and what the next generation will understand about where they came from. The college makes those choices carefully. It has been making them for a very long time. And the old songs it keeps in its deepest archive, in whatever form they originally took and whatever purpose they originally served, continue to sit in the cold stone of a building on the highest ground in Solitude, waiting for someone to ask the right questions about what they actually are. There is a school of magic that does not throw fire or summon creatures or raise the dead. It does not leave scorch marks on walls or shattered stone on floors. It does not announce itself. It works on something quieter and more fundamental than any of those things. It works on the part of you that decides what is real. Illusion magic does not change the world. It changes the person looking at the world. And in a city like Solitude, where political power has always depended as much on perception as on actual force, that distinction matters more than most people living there have ever stopped to consider. Illusion magic sits outside of any specific era in Tamrielic history. It did not begin in one age and develop into another. It has existed as long as Magicka has existed, as long as there have been minds capable of being altered, and practitioners skilled enough to alter them. The schools of Magicka are not inventions. They are categories, organizational frameworks that mortal scholars developed to describe and teach types of magical practice that were already ancient when the first formal academies were established. Illusion was recognized as a distinct school because its underlying mechanism is genuinely different from every other type of magic. Destruction changes physical reality. Conjuration reaches into other planes and pulls things through. Restoration works on the body's own processes. Illusion does none of these things. It works entirely within the mind of its target. The world stays exactly as it is. The person inside it simply experiences something different. At a lore level, illusion magic operates by interacting directly with the consciousness of its target. The spells classified under this school: calm, fury, fear, courage, invisibility, muffle, and their many variations, each alter a specific aspect of how a conscious being processes its environment. Calm does not remove the reason for conflict. It removes the emotional state that would lead to conflict. Fury does not create a genuine threat. It creates the perception of one. Fear does not place real danger in the path of its target. It places the feeling of real danger in the target's mind strongly enough that the mind responds as if the danger were physical. Invisibility is perhaps the most philosophically interesting of the illusion spells in this respect. It does not make the caster physically disappear. It makes the minds of observers around the caster process the caster as absent. The caster is still there. The light still bounces off them. The air still moves around them, but the minds of everyone nearby have been instructed, through magical intervention, to not register any of it. The person is present. The perception of the person has been removed. This distinction between physical reality and experienced reality is the foundation of everything illusion magic does. Solitude's ruling class developed a historical preference for illusion magic over the more aggressive schools, for reasons that reflect the city's particular political character. Destruction magic is visible. A court mage who solves problems with fire and lightning announces the presence of magical force in a way that creates its own political complications. People who see destructive magic used by their government tend to have complicated feelings about it. Fear, resentment, a heightened awareness that they are being governed partly by something they cannot physically contest. Illusion magic creates none of these reactions because it creates no visible evidence of its own use. A population whose emotional states are being gently managed does not know it. A court rival whose threat assessment has been subtly altered does not feel the alteration. A difficult diplomatic meeting whose participants have been quietly calmed does not produce witnesses who can later describe magical intervention. For a city that depended on projecting stability and managing complex political relationships across multiple holds and imperial interests simultaneously, illusion magic was simply the most useful tool available. It solved problems without creating the new problems that visible magical force always generates. The theory that Solitude's political stability has been partly maintained through magical influence on its population is one that the game supports without ever stating directly. It exists in the space between what the lore establishes about illusion magic, what it establishes about Sybil Stentor's role and abilities, and what Solitude looks like as a functioning political entity compared to other holds in Skyrim. Solitude is the most stable hold in Skyrim. It has maintained consistent imperial alignment through periods when other holds fractured, rebelled, or changed allegiance. Its population, even during the civil war that defines the Fourth Era, remains broadly coherent and governable. Whiterun is similar in some respects, but Whiterun's stability comes from its central geography and its deliberate political neutrality. Solitude's stability is more interesting, because Solitude is not neutral. It is deeply committed to a political position that a significant portion of Skyrim's population opposes, and yet its internal cohesion rarely breaks down. Something maintains that cohesion. The most visible candidate for what that something might be has been sitting in the court mage's chair for longer than anyone has thought to ask about. Sybil Stentor is Solitude's court mage. She appears in the Blue Palace as a composed, professionally distant woman who manages magical matters for the court with quiet competence. She sells spells. She provides magical services. She answers questions with the clipped efficiency of someone who has been answering the same categories of question for a very long time. She is not warm. She is not unfriendly. She occupies the particular social register of a specialist who has made herself indispensable enough that her personal manner is no longer subject to the same standards applied to everyone else around her. Most players who encounter her accept this characterization and move on. The ones who pay closer attention notice something else. The dialogue options that open up around Sibyl if you ask the right questions reveal that she has been court mage in Solitude for a very long time. Longer than her apparent age would suggest. Longer, in fact, than any normal human lifespan would support. The game confirms what the attentive player has already suspected. Sibyl Stentor is a vampire. The fact of Sibyl's vampirism raises an immediate question about how she has maintained her position in Solitude's court without being detected or destroyed. Vampires in Skyrim are not subtle figures by default. They require blood. They have specific vulnerabilities. They age differently from mortals. A vampire operating in a court environment, surrounded by people whose job it partly is to notice unusual things about the people around them, should be difficult to hide. Sibyl has hidden it for a very long time. The mechanism by which she has done this is not stated explicitly in the game, but the combination of her vampiric nature and her mastery of illusion magic points toward an answer that requires very little inference. Illusion magic, at a sufficiently advanced level, can manage not just individual interactions, but sustained impressions. A master of illusion magic can maintain a consistent projection of normalcy around herself, not a disguise exactly, but a continuous gentle adjustment of how the people around her perceive and remember her. They notice what she allows them to notice. The rest slides past their awareness, without registering. She has been doing this for so long, and with such consistency, that the Court of Solitude has simply never quite looked at her directly enough to see what is actually there. What Sibyl's situation reveals about illusion magic in practice is something more subtle than simple deception. She is not lying to the people around her in any straightforward sense. She is managing the frame through which they perceive reality. The people in Solitude's court who interact with her daily are not having false information inserted into their minds. They are having certain aspects of their perceptual processing gently redirected, away from the details that would produce the wrong conclusions and toward the details that reinforce the picture of a competent, slightly cold, perfectly normal court mage. The skill required to do this continuously, across multiple people, over years or decades, is not small. It represents a level of illusion mastery that most practitioners never approach. Sibyl has had a long time to practice. She has had the specific professional context of a court environment in which her skills were not just personally useful, but institutionally valued. She became excellent at illusion magic, partly because her survival depended on it. And her survival depended on it in a city that already had a deep institutional relationship with exactly that school of magic. The philosophical question that illusion magic raises about reality in the Elder Scrolls universe is one of the deeper threads running through the lore. The game presents a world in which reality is not as fixed as it appears. The Daedric princes can alter perception on a massive scale. The Thuum creates physical reality through spoken words. The histories of Black Marsh are believed to share a form of collective consciousness that shapes the experience of the Argonians connected to them. Reality in Tamriel has a quality of being partly constructed, not entirely solid, not entirely objective, but responsive to consciousness in ways that make the boundary between what is real and what is perceived genuinely uncertain. Illusion magic sits squarely inside this uncertainty. It works because the boundary is not as firm as it appears. A mind can be redirected. A perception can be altered. The world that a person experiences is not identical to the world that exists independently of experience. Illusion magic is not a trick performed on people who are not paying attention. It is a direct engagement with the fundamental nature of how consciousness and reality interact in a world where that interaction is more fluid than it appears. The schools of Magicka, as formal categories, were developed by mortal scholars trying to organize practices that resisted neat organization. Illusion has always sat uncomfortably in the taxonomy. Destruction, restoration, conjuration, alteration, and enchanting all have clear mechanical descriptions. They do specific things to specific aspects of physical reality in describable ways. Illusion does something different in kind, not just in degree. It operates on consciousness rather than matter. This made it theoretically problematic for the scholars who established the formal schools. Magic that works on the mind raises questions that magic working on fire or stone does not raise. Questions about consent. Questions about the nature of self. Questions about whether a person whose perceptions have been altered by magic is still, in any meaningful sense, making their own decisions. The formal school frameworks sidestepped most of these questions by focusing on mechanics rather than ethics. Here is what illusion spells do. Here is how to cast them. The question of whether you should sits outside the curriculum. Solitude's long relationship with illusion magic has shaped the city's culture in ways that are visible if you know what you are looking at. The city values composure. Public emotional displays are managed carefully. The court operates with a particular smoothness that visitors from other holds sometimes find slightly unnatural. Disagreements resolve too quickly. Tensions that should fester somehow not festering. A general atmosphere of managed calm that sits just slightly outside what a city under the pressures Solitude faces would naturally produce on its own. None of this is impossible to explain through ordinary political skill and long institutional experience. But ordinary political skill and long institutional experience, operating in an environment where the court mage is a centuries-old vampire who is a master of illusion magic and whose survival depends on maintaining exactly this kind of managed calm, produces a specific question. How much of what looks like good governance in Solitude is good governance? And how much of it is illusion magic working on the people who would otherwise be making governance difficult? The game does not answer this. Sybil does not confirm or deny it. The Blue Palace continues to function with its particular quality of slightly too smooth political life. And the court mage sits in her chair and sells spell tomes to travelers who have no idea how long she has been sitting there, or what exactly she has been doing with the skills she is selling. The magic that changes what you see does not announce its presence. It does not leave evidence. It does not produce witnesses who can describe what happened. It works in the space between perception and reality, in the gap that exists in every conscious mind between what is actually there and what the mind decides to register. In a city built on a great arch above a cold sea, in a court that has maintained its particular quality of stability through ages of political pressure and military threat and civil war, that gap has been carefully managed for a very long time. The old songs in the Bards College 2 streets away encode things their singers do not fully understand. The catacombs beneath the city hold the remnants of a queen who refused to accept reality as it was presented to her. And in the Blue Palace, a woman who has not aged in longer than anyone has thought to measure continues to manage the magical affairs of a court that has never quite looked at her directly enough to ask the question her presence makes inevitable. The magic is not in the fire. It never was. It is in the looking. And what you see when you look at Solitude depends entirely on how carefully someone has decided you should be allowed to look. There is a particular kind of power that does not come from armies or thrones. It does not come from magic or divine favor or the strength of walls. It comes from controlling what moves and where it goes. It comes from knowing that every ship passing through a certain stretch of water must deal with you before it deals with anyone else. It comes from sitting at the point where goods from one part of the world meet the people in another part who need those goods, and charging everything that crossing costs. The East Empire Company understood this kind of power completely, and when it chose Solitude as its northern headquarters, it did not choose carelessly. It chose the one city in Skyrim whose geography made that kind of power not just possible, but nearly inevitable. The East Empire Company was not a Skyrim institution. It was an imperial one, a trading organization chartered by the empire itself, given exclusive rights to operate certain trade routes and handle certain categories of goods across Tamriel. Imperial charters of this kind were not uncommon in the Third Era. The empire had long understood that commercial monopolies, properly managed, generated revenue and political loyalty simultaneously. A company that owed its legal existence to an imperial charter had very strong incentives to maintain good relations with whoever issued that charter. The East Empire Company's imperial connections were structural, not incidental. It was created partly as a trade organization and partly as an instrument of imperial commercial policy, a way of extending imperial economic influence into regions where direct military or political control was complicated or undesirable. Skyrim was exactly that kind of region. The holds were proud, the Nords were independent-minded, and direct imperial governance had always required careful management. Economic integration through a company that could make the right people wealthy was a more elegant tool than garrison troops. The choice of Solitude as the company's northern headquarters followed a logic that the city's own geography made obvious. Solitude's harbour was the finest natural anchorage on Skyrim's northern coast. It was sheltered from the worst northern weather by the configuration of the cliffs. It was deep enough for large cargo vessels. It had established approaches that experienced pilots knew how to navigate safely. It sat beneath a city that already had the administrative infrastructure, courts, record-keeping systems, a functioning market that a large trading operation needed to function efficiently. Other cities in Skyrim had harbours. Windhelm had a significant port on the eastern coast. But Windhelm's harbour froze in winter, limiting the trading season in ways that Solitude's harbour, warmed slightly by specific current patterns, did not face to the same degree. Solitude could operate year-round. For a company moving goods continuously, the difference between a harbour that worked 11 months a year and one that worked 12 was not small. It was the difference between a headquarters and a seasonal outpost. The East Empire Company established its Solitude operations through a combination of construction and acquisition. The warehouse district below the arch, the section of Solitude that hugs the cliff face between the upper city and the harbour level, was substantially developed and in some areas entirely built by the company. These warehouses were not simple storage buildings. They were sophisticated logistics facilities designed for the specific requirements of large-volume international trade. Temperature-controlled rooms for goods that required consistent conditions. Separate secured areas for high-value cargo that needed protection beyond what standard warehouse security provided. Loading systems designed to move goods efficiently between ships at the harbour level and storage at the cliff level without the bottlenecks that slowed competing operations in other ports. The company thought about its physical infrastructure the way it thought about everything else, as a system to be optimized for maximum throughput at minimum cost. The warehouses it built below Solitude's arch were, in their way, as carefully engineered as the arch itself. The goods that moved through Solitude's harbour under East Empire Company management came from an extraordinary range of sources. From the south came imperial luxury goods, fine fabrics, quality metalwork, spices and preserved foods from Cyrodiil's warmer agricultural regions, glass and ceramic work from the craftspeople of the imperial city. From the east came goods that had travelled overland or by sea from Morrowind, raw ebony and glass from the volcanic regions, fungal products unique to that province, the particular preserved foods and alchemical ingredients that Dunmer traders specialised in. From Hammerfell came worked metals and leather goods. From High Rock came specific textile traditions and alchemical knowledge encoded in trade goods. Solitude's harbour, at the height of East Empire Company operations, was receiving goods from nearly every province of the empire and passing them on to Nordic buyers who had no other reliable way to access them. The city did not produce most of what it traded. It sat between producers and consumers and charged for the connection. Beneath the visible warehouse district, the company maintained a network of underground passages that connected different parts of its Solitude operation. These passages were not a secret exactly. The company's employees knew about them and used them regularly. But they were not advertised to the general population of Solitude either. The passages served several practical purposes. They allowed the movement of high-value goods between the harbour, the warehouses, and certain points within the upper city, without exposing those goods to the public streets, where theft was an ongoing operational concern. They provided alternative routes for company personnel during periods of civil unrest or weather conditions that made surface movement difficult. Some sections of these underground passages connected to the older cave systems that ran through the limestone of the arch, the same natural and carved spaces that earlier occupants of the site had used for their own purposes, going back to the earliest Nordic settlement. The company, characteristically, did not treat this ancient infrastructure as historically significant. It treated it as usable space and incorporated it into its logistics network without particular ceremony. The company's monopoly on certain categories of northern trade did not benefit everyone in Solitude's economic ecosystem equally. The fishing communities along the Halfingar coast outside the city itself felt the company's presence as pressure rather than opportunity. Small-scale Norse traders who had operated independently along the northern coast for generations found themselves increasingly squeezed by the company's ability to undercut their prices on some goods and block their access to certain markets entirely. The imperial charter that gave the company its exclusive rights was a legal instrument that small traders had no mechanism to challenge. They could not outcompete a company with the capital, infrastructure, and political connections the East Empire Company possessed. What they could do was find the gaps, the categories of goods the company did not bother with, because the margins were too small, the routes the company did not service, because the volume was too low. The independent traders of Halfingar's coast survived in the spaces the company found uninteresting. It was not a comfortable existence, but it was an existence. The specific effect of the company's monopoly on Solitude's fishing communities was felt not just in economics, but in culture. Nordic fishing communities along the Halfingar coast had maintained traditions of independent coastal trade that stretched back to the earliest Atmaran settlements. The idea that a fisher could catch and sell and trade along the coast according to their own judgment was not just an economic practice. It was part of how those communities understood themselves as self-sufficient people whose relationship with the sea was direct and personal, not mediated by any institution sitting between them and their livelihood. The East Empire Company did not destroy this self-understanding directly, but it changed the conditions in which it operated until the practice could no longer support the self-image. Fishers who had sold their catch directly to buyers now found those buyers locked into company supply arrangements. Coastal traders who had moved goods between small settlements found company operations handling the same routes at scales they could not match. The culture of independent coastal trade did not disappear immediately. It eroded slowly, over generations, as the practical basis for it narrowed year by year. The height of East Empire Company operations in Solitude coincided with the city's greatest period of material wealth. The Blue Palace was maintained and decorated at a standard that reflected the tax revenue generated by harbour operations. The city's infrastructure, roads, public buildings, the maintenance of the arch and its approaches, was funded partly by the economic activity the company generated and the imperial revenue it channeled through Solitude's administrative systems. The merchants who worked within the company's supply chains rather than against them prospered in ways that created a visible wealthy class in Solitude distinct from the hold's traditional nobility. This new wealth was commercial rather than hereditary. It came from trade volume and margin rather than land ownership and military service. The presence of this commercial wealthy class alongside the traditional Nordic aristocracy of the hold created social dynamics in Solitude that were distinct from other Skyrim cities, a more complex social hierarchy with more competing interests and more varied sources of status and influence than holds whose economies remained primarily agricultural and martial. The company's decline in the Fourth Era was not a single event. It was a long unwinding. The chaos following the Oblivion Crisis, the events at the end of the Third Era that reshaped the political landscape of Tamriel, disrupted the trade networks and political arrangements that the company depended on. The weakening of imperial authority across the provinces made the imperial charter that underpinned the company's monopoly rights harder to enforce. Competitors who had been blocked by that charter's legal weight found it easier to operate as the enforcement capacity behind it diminished. The Great War between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion in the Fourth Era further disrupted the southern trade connections that had fed Solitude's harbour with goods from across Tamriel. By the time the civil war in Skyrim that defines the game's present-day storyline begins, the East Empire Company's Solitude operation is a diminished version of what it once was, still present, still operational, but visibly struggling with piracy problems it cannot manage, supply disruptions it cannot resolve, and a harbour that no longer moves the volume of goods it once did. What the company's decline did to Solitude's economy was painful, in the specific way that losing something you had built your identity around is always painful. The city had spent generations understanding itself as the commercial capital of Skyrim, the place where the world's goods arrived and were distributed northward. That self-understanding had shaped the city's architecture, its social structure, its political culture, and its relationship with every other hold in Skyrim. Other holds produced things. Solitude moved things. The distinction had felt permanent because it had lasted so long. When the company's decline made it no longer reliably true, Solitude did not have an immediate alternative identity to replace it with. The imperial alignment that had always been the city's political anchor was increasingly a liability rather than an asset as imperial authority weakened and Stormcloak sentiment grew in the holds around it. The harbour that had once made Solitude the centre of northern commerce sat quieter than it had in living memory. The warehouses below the arch held less than they once had. And the city on the great arch above the cold sea, which had always faced outward toward the wider world, with the confidence of a place that knew its value, began for the first time to wonder whether that value was as permanent as it had always assumed. The port that had moved the world did not stop existing. The harbour was still there. The arch was still there. The infrastructure the company had built still stood, somewhat maintained, somewhat neglected, in the limestone spaces below the city. The capacity for Solitude to be what it had been under the company's height was not gone. It was dormant, waiting for the political and economic conditions that would allow it to function again at full scale. Whether those conditions would arrive was a question the city's present could not answer. The East Empire Company had shown Solitude what it was capable of being when the right external structures supported it. The company's decline had shown the city what it looked like when those structures failed. Between those two versions of itself, the city that moved the world and the city that watched the harbour sit quiet, Solitude continued, as cities do, managing the distance between what it had been and what it currently was, with the particular combination of pride and anxiety that belongs to places that remember being greater than they presently appear. Every war has a moment before it becomes a war. A specific day, a specific room, a specific set of decisions made by specific people that transforms a political tension into something that cannot be walked back. For Skyrim, that moment happened in the Blue Palace in Solitude. It happened between two men who, by most accounts, genuinely respected each other. It happened according to a tradition that was either an ancient and legitimate form of Nordic justice or a murder dressed in ceremonial clothing, depending entirely on who you ask. High King Torygg died in that room. The civil war that tore Skyrim apart was born in the same moment, and the city of Solitude, which had built its entire identity around stability and imperial order, found itself at the centre of the fracture it had always believed it was too well governed to experience. Torygg was young when he became High King of Skyrim. The lore does not give his exact age at the time of his death, but the picture that emerges from the game's dialogue and background material is of a man who had not been ruling long enough to have developed the particular hardness that long rule produces. He was thoughtful. He was genuinely interested in the history and traditions of his people in a way that was not purely political performance. He read. He considered questions carefully rather than deciding them quickly for the sake of appearing decisive. These qualities might have made him an excellent ruler given time. They also meant that when Ulfric Stormcloak walked into the Blue Palace and issued his challenge, Torygg was facing a situation that his character had not prepared him for, not because he was weak, but because he was the kind of person who genuinely believed that difficult political problems could be worked through by people of goodwill, if they were willing to think carefully enough. Torygg's relationship with Ulfric before the challenge was not one of simple political opposition. The game establishes through dialogue, particularly in conversations with Elisif the Fair after Torygg's death, that Torygg had genuine respect for Ulfric. He admired Ulfric's connection to traditional Nordic values. He found Ulfric's arguments about Talos worship and Nordic independence genuinely compelling on their own terms, even when he disagreed with them politically. There is a line in the game that carries particular weight. The suggestion that if Ulfric had simply asked Torygg to support the cause of Talos worship, Torygg might have listened seriously. He was not an ideological enemy of everything Ulfric represented. He was a young king trying to navigate the impossible position of being a Nordic ruler, whose hold on power depended on maintaining imperial favour, while genuinely loving the culture that imperial policy was increasingly asking him to suppress. Ulfric did not ask. He challenged. And that choice, to challenge rather than persuade, says something important about what Ulfric actually wanted from the encounter. The old Nordic tradition of the single combat challenge, the right of one man to challenge another for their position, was real within the lore of Elder Scrolls culture. It was not invented by Ulfric for this occasion. It existed as part of the ancient framework of Nordic political life, rooted in the same period when strength and the demonstrated capacity to lead were considered inseparable. The tradition held that a man could challenge a ruler directly, and if the ruler accepted and lost, the challenger's claim to their position was legitimate by the oldest laws of Nordic society. Ulfric invoked this tradition when he walked into the Blue Palace. He did so knowing several things that Torygg either did not know or did not fully understand. He knew that Torygg would accept. A Nordic High King who refused the challenge would lose the respect of every traditional Nord in Skyrim regardless of any other consideration. The challenge was constructed so that the act of refusing it was as politically damaging as the act of losing it. Torygg had no good option. Accepting meant fighting a man who had trained for combat his entire life and possessed the Thuum. Refusing meant surrendering the cultural legitimacy that was his primary connection to the Nordic population he ruled. The exact nature of what the Thuum did to Torygg is one of the most debated questions in Elder Scrolls fan discussion, and the game handles it carefully enough to sustain the debate deliberately. Ulfric used the voice against Torygg during the challenge. The Thuum, the dragon shout, is not a conventional weapon. It is the use of specific words of power in the dragon language to create effects in the physical world. What Ulfric did to Torygg with the voice staggered him, broke him physically in some way that left him unable to continue the fight, and then Ulfric killed him with a conventional weapon while he was incapacitated. The question is whether this constitutes legitimate use of the Thuum within the traditional challenge framework, or whether it represents a profound violation of what the challenge was supposed to be. Traditional Nordic single combat was a test of individual martial skill and will. The Thuum is not exactly a martial skill in the conventional sense. It is a magical power of enormous force. Using it against an opponent who does not possess it is not a contest between equals. It is closer to bringing a weapon to a fight where the rules assume both participants are comparably armed. The imperial position on Torygg's death was unambiguous. The Empire classified it as murder, not a legitimate challenge under Nordic tradition, not a political succession through customary means, but the unlawful killing of a crowned high king by a political agitator using magical force. This classification served imperial political purposes. It made Ulfric a criminal rather than a legitimate claimant and provided the legal framework for military action against him. But the classification was not purely cynical. There was a genuine legal and ethical argument behind it. Torygg was the High King of Skyrim under imperial law. Imperial law did not recognize the ancient Nordic challenge tradition as superseding its own framework for political succession. Under the legal system that Skyrim had been governed by throughout the Third Era and into the Fourth, what Ulfric did was not a duel. It was an assassination with extra steps. The Empire's position was harsh, but it was legally coherent within its own framework. The traditional Nordic position was equally coherent within its own framework and arrived at the opposite conclusion. Ulfric had followed the ancient forms. He had issued the challenge publicly. Torygg had accepted. The combat had taken place. Ulfric had won. Under the oldest Norse understanding of how political legitimacy was established and transferred, the outcome was valid. The High Kingship should have passed to Ulfric by right of victory. The fact that Ulfric used the Thuum was not, from this perspective, a disqualifying violation. The voice was a Nordic gift, the ancient power of the Nordic people expressed through a specific individual who had trained to use it. Using the greatest expression of Nordic cultural and spiritual identity in a traditional Nordic challenge was not cheating. It was the fullest possible expression of what the tradition was supposed to demonstrate. That this interpretation conveniently served Ulfric's political ambitions did not automatically make it wrong. Convenient arguments can still be correct. The law holds both positions without collapsing them into each other, and that deliberate ambiguity is one of the most carefully sustained features of the Civil War narrative. Elisif the Fair was left to hold Solitude together in the immediate aftermath of her husband's death. She was young. She had not been prepared for sole governance. Torygg's death was not a succession anyone had planned for. The court around her, the advisors, the steward, the general, had their own positions and their own agendas, and Elisif found herself at the center of a political structure that was simultaneously offering her support and pulling in multiple directions. Her grief was real. The game does not present it as performance. She had loved Torygg in a way that was not just dynastic. She talks about him in terms that suggest she is mourning a specific person she had known and trusted, not just a political partner whose loss has created administrative complications. Managing that grief, while managing a hold that had just become the symbolic center of an imperial military effort against the man who killed her husband, required something from Elisif that her youth and her character had not previously been tested to provide. She provided it imperfectly, as people managing impossible situations usually do. Solitude's population fractured after Torygg's death in a way that the city's carefully maintained surface of stability worked hard to conceal. The fracture was not primarily between Imperial sympathizers and Stormcloak sympathizers, though that division existed. It was more fundamental than that. It was a fracture between two ways of understanding what had just happened in the Blue Palace. One understanding held that a legitimate Nordic tradition had been invoked, a challenge had been issued and accepted, and the outcome was valid regardless of personal feelings about Ulfric or his politics. People who held this view were not necessarily Stormcloak supporters. Some of them had no particular sympathy for Ulfric's cause. They simply believed that the old forms had been followed, and that attacking Ulfric for following them was an attack on something older and more important than any individual political dispute. The other understanding held that a young and thoughtful king had been killed by a calculating political actor who had used superior force against an opponent who had no real choice but to accept a challenge he could not win. People who held this view were not all Imperial loyalists either. Some of them simply thought that what had happened in the Blue Palace was wrong by any standard of fairness, regardless of which legal framework you use to evaluate it. The city managed this fracture the way Solitude has always managed difficult internal tensions, by not naming it directly. The official position was clear. Torrig had been murdered. Ulfric was a criminal. The Imperial military effort to capture him was just and necessary. This official position was enforced not through persecution of those who thought differently, but through the quieter mechanisms of a court culture that had long practice in making certain views feel socially costly to express openly. The people in Solitude who privately believed that the challenge had been legitimate did not announce this belief in public spaces where it could be heard by the wrong people. They held it quietly, in private conversations with people they trusted, and they maintained the public presentation of loyalty that Solitude's court expected. The city looked unified from the outside. Inside, in the private spaces where people actually said what they thought, it was something more complicated. Something that the East Empire Company's decline and the Thalmor's presence and the ongoing civil war were slowly making harder to keep contained within the social conventions that had previously managed it. The death of Torrig did something to Solitude beyond the political and the military. It did something to the city's relationship with its own self-image. Solitude had always understood itself as the city that stability built and stability protected, the most imperially aligned hold, the most governed, the most insulated from the kind of raw political violence that happened in other places, in less sophisticated cities, in holds without Solitude's long tradition of careful management. And then the violence happened in the Blue Palace, in the throne room, between a High King and a challenger who had walked in through the front door in front of witnesses. The image of governance that Solitude projected to itself and to Skyrim was not destroyed by this. But it was marked. The Blue Palace, which had always symbolized the idea that Solitude was the place where Skyrim was managed rather than the place where Skyrim's conflicts played out, was now also the place where the High King had died on the floor while his young wife watched. Both things were true simultaneously. The city that the Arch had always announced to the world as the seat of stable authority was also now the city where the Civil War had been born. Solitude carried both versions of itself forward from that day, uneasily, into whatever came next. There is a building on a hill outside Solitude that most people in the city try not to think about too directly. It sits in the cold air above the road, surrounded by walls that are higher than they need to be for a diplomatic residence, staffed by people who are polite in the specific way that makes politeness feel like a warning. The Thalmor Embassy does not announce itself as a place of power. It presents itself as a place of administration, a necessary piece of Imperial Aldmeri diplomatic infrastructure, nothing more. Most people who pass near it accept this description because the alternative, thinking carefully about what actually happens inside those walls and what the people inside them actually want, is an uncomfortable exercise that produces no good options. The embassy has been there long enough that its presence has become ordinary, and ordinary is exactly what the Thalmor intended it to become. The Thalmor did not exist in their current form before the Great War. They were a political faction within the Aldmeri Dominion, the alliance of elven peoples centered on the Somerset Isles and Valenwood, but rose to dominance within that alliance through a combination of ideological conviction and political elimination of their rivals. The ideology they carried was specific and, from a certain perspective, internally consistent. The Thalmor believed that the elven peoples of Tamriel were the original and rightful inheritors of the continent. They believed that human civilization, and the Empire in particular, represented a historical deviation from the correct order of things. They believed that Talos, the divine figure that the Empire had elevated to godhood from his origins as the man Tiber Septim, was a false god, whose worship represented an active offense against the nature of the universe. These were not casual political positions. They were the foundational convictions of an organization that had spent decades consolidating power within the Dominion by presenting them as self-evident truths that only the naive or the corrupt could fail to recognize. The Great War between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion ended with the White Gold Concordat, a peace agreement signed in the 4th century of the Fourth Era that reflected the military reality of a conflict neither side had clearly won. The Empire retained its existence and its territory. The Dominion retained significant political concessions, the most consequential of which was the formal banning of Talos worship throughout Imperial territory. From the Dominion's perspective, this was not a minor administrative detail. It was the core objective the war had been fought to achieve. From the Empire's perspective, it was a painful but survivable concession, the price of ending a war that the Empire could not afford to continue indefinitely. From the perspective of the Nords of Skyrim, it was something else entirely. Talos was not simply a god among other gods in Nordic religious life. He was Tuba Septim. He was the man who had united Tamriel. He was a Nord, or believed by many Nords to be one, who had ascended to divinity through deeds of genuine greatness. Being told by an imperial treaty that this figure could no longer be worshipped openly was not experienced as a political inconvenience. It was experienced as a direct attack on Nordic cultural identity, administered by the very empire that Nordic loyalty had helped build and maintain. The Thalmor embassy near Solitude was established as part of the infrastructure the Concordat created for monitoring imperial compliance with its terms. The banning of Talos worship required enforcement. The Empire, having agreed to the ban, was theoretically responsible for that enforcement. But the Thalmor did not trust imperial authorities to enforce the ban with the consistency and thoroughness that the Dominion required. So the embassy was not simply a diplomatic residence. It was an enforcement monitoring station, a base from which Thalmor agents could observe whether the suppression of Talos worship was being carried out adequately, and, where it was not, take their own action. The location near Solitude was deliberate. Solitude was the most imperially aligned city in Skyrim. If Talos worship was being suppressed anywhere in the province, it would be suppressed most consistently in Solitude. Establishing the embassy near the most compliant city in Skyrim gave the Thalmor a base of operations that was politically safe, while still placing them close enough to the rest of the province to reach it when they needed to. What Thalmor agents actually do in and around Solitude covers a range of activities that the game reveals gradually through found documents, overheard conversations, and the contents of the embassy itself if the Dragonborn manages to access them. At the most visible level, they monitor religious practice. Thalmor Justiciars, the enforcement arm of the organization, move through Skyrim looking for active Talos worship. Shrines are reported. Worshippers are identified. People who persist in open Talos worship after initial warnings are arrested, interrogated, and in cases the Thalmor consider serious, made to disappear in ways that do not produce publicly visible consequences. The interrogation methods used at the embassy are not gentle. The cells beneath the diplomatic residence are not there for storage. The Thalmor's approach to religious enforcement in Skyrim reflects their broader ideological conviction that they are not suppressing a legitimate faith, but eliminating a dangerous heresy, and that the methods appropriate for eliminating heresy are not constrained by the diplomatic niceties that govern their surface interactions with imperial officials and city authorities. Beyond religious enforcement, Thalmor agents in Solitude operate as an intelligence network. The embassy maintains files on significant figures throughout Skyrim, their political positions, their private beliefs, their potential usefulness or dangerousness to Thalmor objectives. The documents accessible during the Dragonborn's infiltration of the embassy reveal the operational sophistication of this network. Agents are embedded in communities throughout the province. Information flows back to the embassy through channels that ordinary people would not identify as intelligence gathering. The Thalmor's interest in the civil war between the Imperials and the Stormcloaks is documented in these files with a clarity that is illuminating. They want neither side to win decisively. A Stormcloak victory would mean an independent Skyrim outside Imperial control, which would remove the treaty framework that gives the Thalmor their operational authority in the province. An Imperial victory would mean a strengthened empire, which is contrary to the Thalmor's long-term objective of Imperial dissolution. A prolonged, draining conflict that weakens both sides simultaneously is the outcome that best serves Thalmor interests. They are not managing the civil war from the embassy, but they are certainly not trying to end it. The specific Thalmor figures connected to the embassy reveal the range of functions it serves. Elenwen, the first emissary, is the public face of the Thalmor in Skyrim, a diplomat who hosts parties at the embassy for Solitude's social elite, who maintains the appearance of normal diplomatic function, and who manages the organization's political relationships with imperial authorities in the province. Her social events at the embassy are not innocent networking opportunities. They are intelligence-gathering operations conducted in the format of parties. The guests who attend, merchants, officials, minor nobility from Solitude's court, leave having enjoyed an evening and having provided, through their conversations and their social behavior, information that Thalmor analysts process afterward. Rulindil, the third emissary, handles the less publicly presentable aspects of embassy operations, the interrogations, the intelligence analysis, the management of informants. The division of labor between Elenwen and Rulindil represents the division between the embassy's surface and its interior, the social function that maintains its legitimacy, and the operational function that fulfills its actual purpose. Both are necessary. The surface would not survive without the interior's results. The interior could not operate without the surface's cover. The suppression of Talos worship divided Solitude's population in a way that cut across the other fault lines already running through the city. The division was not simply between those who worshipped Talos and those who did not. It was between people who experienced the suppression as a personal attack and people who had made peace with it as a political necessity. Solitude's imperial alignment had always required its population to accept certain costs. The cost of housing imperial troops, the cost of maintaining treaty obligations that did not always serve Nordic interests, the cost of presenting a unified front to the empire even when internal opinion was divided. The suppression of Talos worship was a different kind of cost. Previous imperial demands had been material or administrative. This one was interior. It reached into the private religious life of people who had grown up with Talos as a genuine divine presence and told them that presence was no longer legally permitted. People who had prayed to Talos quietly in their homes, who had maintained small private shrines, who had taught their children that the man who had united Tamriel deserved reverence. These people were not political agitators. They were ordinary Nords, living ordinary religious lives that had abruptly become criminal. The way the Thalmor used Solitude's imperial loyalty against its own cultural traditions was precise and patient. The mechanism worked like this. Solitude's governing class had committed to imperial alignment as the foundation of the city's political identity. That commitment was not casual. It was structural. The East Empire Company's presence, the harbor's trade connections, the Blue Palace's relationship with imperial authority, the Hold's military arrangements, all of it depended on maintaining the imperial relationship in good standing. Challenging the White Gold Concordat's Talos provision meant challenging that entire structure. The Thalmor understood this. They had chosen to place their embassy near the most imperial-aligned city in Skyrim, precisely because imperial alignment was that city's deepest political commitment. Asking Solitude's leadership to resist Talos suppression was asking them to prioritize their cultural identity over their political survival. The Thalmor had constructed the situation so that the city's greatest strength, its consistent, reliable imperial loyalty, functioned as the mechanism of its own cultural compliance. Solitude did not suppress Talos worship because it agreed with the Thalmor's theology. It suppressed Talos worship because not suppressing it would cost more than its leadership was willing to pay. The Thalmor had simply arranged the costs correctly. The hidden shrines of Talos in Solitude tell the other part of this story. They exist in the game in corners and quiet spaces, small, concealed, maintained by people who have not stopped believing, but who have learned to believe privately. The presence of these hidden shrines in the most imperially aligned city in Skyrim is not a contradiction. It is the logical result of a suppression that changed the visibility of religious practice, without changing the religious feeling that produced it. The people who maintain hidden Talos shrines in Solitude are not rebels in any organized sense. They are people doing what people always do when something important to them is made officially impermissible, finding the smallest possible space where it can still exist, and maintaining it there with the particular care that comes from knowing its loss would be permanent. The Thalmor's enforcement apparatus looks for these shrines. It finds some of them. The ones it does not find persist in their hidden corners, tended by people who walk past the embassy on the hill and say nothing and feel everything. The embassy on the hill represents something that Solitude had not encountered in quite this form before. A foreign presence operating within its political space that was not accountable to the city's own authority structures. Previous external influences on Solitude had been economic, like the East Empire Company, or military, like the Imperial Garrison. Both of those operated within frameworks that Solitude's governing class could negotiate with, push back against, or appeal to higher authority about. The Thelmore Embassy operated under the White Gold Concordat, which meant its authority in certain areas superseded both local and imperial administrative oversight. The justiciars who arrested Talos worshippers in Solitude's streets were not answerable to Solitude's Jarl. They were not answerable to the imperial military commander in the city. They were answerable to Elenwen, who was answerable to the Eldmeri Dominion. For a city whose entire political identity was built around the idea of stable, ordered governance within a clear chain of authority, the presence of an external power operating in its territory outside that chain was a profound institutional discomfort. The discomfort was managed, as Solitude managed most discomforts, by not naming it directly. The embassy remained on its hill. The parties continued, the justiciars continued their work, and the city continued to present to the world the image of a place where everything was properly governed, while inside its walls, in its hidden shrines and its private conversations and its quiet factional divisions, the reality of what the embassy's presence meant continued its slow and unacknowledged work. Every city is two cities. There is the city that moves during the day, the market stalls and the guard rotations and the conversations between people who need things from each other. And there is the city that stays still when all of that stops. The city that exists in the stone and the silence and the slow, cold air coming in from the sea. Most people live entirely in the first city. They move through the second one every night without noticing it, sleeping above foundations that have been holding the weight of human life for longer than any current resident's family has been alive. Solitude is both of these cities simultaneously. But the second one, the quiet one, the one made of stone and memory and the long accumulation of everything that happened here, is older and deeper and more permanent than anything happening on its surface on any given day. That city does not sleep. It simply waits, the way stone waits, without urgency and without end. The folk beliefs of Solitude's people about the great arch beneath their city are not taught in any formal context. They are not written in official histories or preserved in the Bards College's catalogued collection. They exist in the way that real folk beliefs always exist, passed between people in casual conversation, mentioned in the particular tone that sits between seriousness and superstition, carried forward not because anyone decided they were worth preserving, but because they kept feeling true enough to repeat. The most persistent of these beliefs holds that the arch is not simply stone, that something lives in the limestone, not a creature, not a spirit in any conventional sense, but a quality of awareness that accumulated in the rock over the thousands of years of human and elven life that took place on and around it. The arch has been a watchtower. It has been a garrison. It has been a dragon cult site, a Nordic hold seat, an imperial administrative centre, the home of a necromancer queen and the headquarters of a commercial empire. According to the folk belief, all of that left something behind. Not memories exactly, more like weight. The stone carries the accumulated pressure of everything that happened inside it. And on certain nights, when the wind comes in from the sea at the right angle, that weight becomes something you can almost feel. The ghost stories of Solitude are numerous and specific in the way that ghost stories in old cities always are. They are not vague atmospheric feelings. They are accounts of particular figures seen in particular places at particular times of night. The most commonly reported figure is a woman in old clothing seen in the corridors of the Blue Palace's lower levels, not Patema, whose presence in the catacombs has its own separate tradition. But an older figure whose description does not match any historically identified person connected to the palace. She does not speak in any account. She walks in a specific direction and disappears at a specific point in the corridor, where the older stonework meets the imperial renovation layer. People who have seen her, according to the stories, do not feel frightened exactly. They feel interrupted, as if they have accidentally stepped into a moment from another time that was not meant to be visible from the present. She appears, and then she is gone, and the corridor is just a corridor again, and the person who saw her is left with the particular feeling of having briefly touched something that exists just outside the edge of what the present moment normally allows. The warehouse district below the arch has its own category of stories that differ in character from the Blue Palace accounts. Where the palace ghosts tend to be quiet and specific, the stories from the harbour district describe something more ambient, a sense of presence that attaches to the area as a whole, rather than to particular figures. Sailors who have spent the night in the harbour area describe hearing sounds that do not match the normal patterns of a working port at rest. Not dramatic sounds. Not chains rattling or voices calling from the water. Smaller sounds. The particular creak of a dock under weight when there is nothing on it. The sound of something being moved in a warehouse that should be empty. Footsteps on cobblestones that stop when you stop to listen for them. The harbour district was a place of continuous human activity for centuries during the East Empire Company's height of operations. People worked there at all hours. Goods moved through it at night as well as day. The accumulated sound of all that movement, according to the folk tradition, did not entirely stop when the activity slowed. Some portion of it persisted in the stones and the timber of the dock structures, not as genuine supernatural presence, but as a quality of the place that had been shaped by so much continuous human activity that silence there never felt entirely complete. What happens in Solitude late at night when the market closes and the last fires go down has a specific quality that the city's daytime life does not prepare you for. The wind comes in from the sea of ghosts without obstruction at the city's higher elevations. During the day, the sounds of the market and the movement of people provide a constant background that absorbs the wind sound and makes it part of the general texture of city life. At night, when those other sounds are gone, the wind becomes the primary voice of the place. It moves through the gaps in the stonework. It finds the particular hollows and channels in the arch's limestone that have been shaped by water erosion over thousands of years. And in those channels, it produces sounds that are not quite random, low tones that vary with the wind's direction and strength, occasional higher notes when a specific channel is struck at the right angle, a continuous low breath that the city's long-time residents learn to sleep through without noticing, and that visitors find either soothing or unsettling depending on their temperament. This sound is not supernatural. It is geology and wind in conversation, the same conversation that shaped the arch in the first place. But in the dark, when the city is quiet, it sounds like something that has been talking for a very long time and does not particularly need anyone to be listening. The superstitions that Solitude's people carry about the sea below the arch are old and practical in their origins. The Sea of Ghosts earned its name from something. The exact origin of the name is debated, but the folk tradition in Halfingr connects it to the particular way the northern sea behaves in certain weather conditions. When cold air from the north meets warmer surface water along the Halfingr coast, the temperature difference produces a low mist that sits on the water's surface and moves with a quality that people have always found reminiscent of something that should not be moving the way it moves. The mist rolls and shifts in ways that suggest in dim light figures moving across the water's surface. Nordic fishermen along the Halfingr coast developed a specific set of practices around this phenomenon. Things you did not do when the sea mist was heavy, directions you did not look in for too long, words you said quietly when the mist was thickest that acknowledged the presence of whatever the sea carried without inviting it any closer. These practices were never religious in any formal sense. They were the accumulated practical wisdom of people who spent their lives near a body of water that behaved in ways that made a certain cautious respect feel more reasonable than dismissiveness. The slow philosophical idea at the center of any very old city is one that its residents rarely articulate directly, because it is too large and too obvious to feel like it needs articulation. A city is not its buildings. It is not its current population, or its present government, or its most recent significant events. A city is a collection of decisions made by people who are mostly dead now. Decisions about where to put a wall, which road to widen, which building to tear down, and what to replace it with, which stories to tell about what happened in a particular place, and which stories to let fade. Every current feature of Solitude is the result of a chain of these decisions, stretching back through more generations than anyone currently living can fully trace. The Great Arch was here before any decision was made about it, but every wall built on it, every structure raised and torn down and replaced, every use the space has been put to across its long history, these were all choices. Someone decided. Someone looked at what was there and decided what it should become next. And the accumulation of all those decisions layered on top of each other in the stone and the layout and the invisible cultural inheritance of the place, is what solitude actually is. Not the buildings, the choosing, the long, continuous, mostly forgotten act of people deciding what this particular piece of high ground above a cold sea should be used for next. The weight of time in solitude is not evenly distributed. It concentrates in specific places. The older sections of the city where the stonework predates imperial renovation, the lower levels of buildings where the foundations go deep into the arch's limestone, the passages and spaces that have been used continuously since before anyone thought to record their use. People who spend time in these older sections of the city sometimes describe a quality that is difficult to name precisely, a density, a particular kind of quiet that feels different from simply the absence of sound. The older the stone, the more generations of human life have taken place against it, the more completely the sounds and movements of all those lives have been absorbed into its surface. Stone is not a recording medium in any literal sense, but people who have lived near very old stone for a long time often develop the intuition that it is. That the particular quality of silence in a space where many people have lived and died and spoken and been quiet is not simply silence. It is something that holds the shape of all that former presence, the way a worn step holds the shape of the feet that wore it down. Solitude's relationship with its own history is complicated by the fact that its history contains things the city would prefer to present selectively. The Wolf Queen's catacombs are beneath the city right now, sealed but present. The dragon cult's influence shaped the ground the Bards College sits on. The snow elves, whose territory this was before any Nord set foot here, left no monuments that the city has chosen to acknowledge. The East Empire Company's warehouses below the arch are partly abandoned, partly repurposed. Their former function as the engine of a commercial empire, visible only in the scale of what was built there. The Thalmor Embassy sits on its hill, processing intelligence and suppressing worship that most of the city's population privately maintains. None of these things are hidden exactly. They are all present, all real, all accessible to anyone willing to look carefully. What Solitude has chosen is not to hide them, but to not foreground them, to present the city's current face, its imperial stability and its market prosperity and its political authority, without making the layers underneath that face the subject of official attention. This is not dishonesty. It is the ordinary curatorial work of any city that has accumulated more history than its current self-presentation can comfortably contain. There is a particular kind of rest that comes from being in a very old place and allowing yourself to feel its age rather than resisting it. Most people, most of the time, move through old places with the protective layer of the present firmly in place, aware that the stones are old in an abstract sense, but not actually feeling the weight of the time those stones represent. The protective layer is useful. Without it, every walk through an ancient city would be overwhelming. The accumulative sense of all the lives lived and ended in the same space would not leave room for the ordinary business of the present. But occasionally, usually at night, usually when the ordinary business of the present has gone quiet and the wind is coming in from the sea, and the city's surface layer of current activity has temporarily stopped, the protective layer becomes thinner. The age of the place comes through it, not as a burden, not as sadness, as something closer to perspective, the quiet recognition that the present moment is one layer in a very long accumulation, that what feels urgent and permanent right now is being added to a pile that contains the urgencies and permanencies of 1,000 generations who are no longer here to argue for their continued importance. Tamriel does not end. This is perhaps the deepest truth the Elder Scrolls universe keeps returning to in its quietest moments. Empires end. Civilizations end. Individual lives end with the particular finality that makes each one feel like a small world going dark. But the world itself keeps turning. The eras roll forward. The Dawn era gave way to the Merethic era. The Merethic era gave way to the First era. Each age contained people who believed that what they were building would last, and each age was followed by something that changed what lasting meant. The Snow Elves who lived on the Harfingar coast believed they would always be there. The Atmorans who crossed the sea believed they were building something permanent. The dragon priests who ruled from the high places believed the dragons would never fall. Potema Septim believed her will was strong enough to outlast death itself. The East Empire Company believed its monopoly was the natural permanent state of northern commerce. Every one of these beliefs was wrong in the specific terms in which it was held. and the world kept going. The arch kept standing. The sea kept moving. The wind kept finding the channels in the limestone and making its low sound in the dark. You are resting in a world that has been here for longer than you can fully imagine. The stones beneath Solitude were shaped before any human or elf gave them a name. The sea below the arch has been cold and grey since before the first settlement, before the first ship, before the first fire, on a cliff above the water that signaled to someone approaching from the north that they had found the right shore. Everything that happened here, the snow elves and their sea knowledge, the Atmorans and their wooden ships, the dragon priests and their terrible authority, the wolf queen and her refusal to let go, the bards and their hidden songs, the traders and their harbour empire, the young king and the challenge that started a war, the embassy on the hill and its patient long work, all of it is in the stone now, absorbed, held, not gone, just quiet. The way everything eventually goes quiet when enough time passes and the world keeps turning, and the particular urgency that made things matter so much in their moment softens into the general weight of a place that has seen many things and holds them all with equal patience. The arch remembers. It does not judge what it remembers. It simply holds it, the way stone holds everything, without preference, without commentary, without end. Rest now. The world has been here a very long time. It will be here when you wake.